The night my family locked me out. It was snowing so hard I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. I sat behind a gas station with a trash bag full of clothes while my sister posted photos from our mansion's heated pool party, wearing the necklace my mother stole from me. This is a fictional story inspired by dramatic themes and does not depict real events or individuals. Any resemblance to actual persons or situations is purely coincidental. I still remember the sound of the lock more than the cold. That sharp metallic click echoed louder than the wind outside our mansion, louder than my mother's screaming, louder than my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. One second I was standing inside the marble hallway trying to explain myself, and the next I was staring at the closed front door with nothing but a thin sweater, damp sneakers, and a black trash bag filled with whatever clothes my sister had thrown at me. Snow was falling hard enough to blur the streetlights. The flakes melted against my cheeks like icy needles while I stood frozen on the front steps, waiting for someone to open the door again. Nobody did. I knocked once at first, quietly, because part of me still believed this had to be a misunderstanding. My mother had been furious before, but she always calmed down eventually. She had to. I was her daughter. "Mom?" My voice shook so badly it barely sounded human. "Please just let me explain." Nothing. I knocked harder this time. Through the stained glass window beside the entrance, I could see shadows moving inside. They were still there. They were listening. Then my younger sister Vanessa appeared behind the glass holding a wine glass in one hand. She looked perfectly warm in her silk cream-colored pajamas while snow soaked through my socks outside. For a second our eyes met, and I felt relief rush through me. Vanessa would help me. She always pretended to be the sweet one. But instead of opening the door, she smirked. Actually smirked. Then she slowly reached forward and pulled the curtain shut in my face. That was the exact moment something inside me cracked. Not because of the cold. Not even because I had nowhere to go. Because I finally understood they had planned this together. An hour earlier, we'd been sitting at the dining table pretending to have a normal family dinner. Crystal chandeliers glowed above us while servers carried plates. Nobody touched. My father barely looked up from his phone all night. Vanessa kept checking social media and laughing to herself. My mother sat at the head of the table with that tight expression she wore whenever she was preparing to destroy someone. Usually that someone was me. "You embarrassed this family again," she finally snapped, tossing a gossip magazine onto the table. The headline showed a blurry photo of me leaving a cafe with my ex-boyfriend, Daniel. According to the article, he'd dumped Vanessa because he was secretly in love with me. None of it was true. Daniel and I had met accidentally to return some old books he'd left behind years ago, but truth never mattered in our house. Vanessa immediately started crying beside me, soft fake tears rolling down perfectly contoured cheeks. "I can't believe you'd do this to me again," she whispered. Again. That word made me sick. My entire life, every family disaster somehow became my fault. If Vanessa crashed her car, I distracted her. If my mother lost investors, I stressed her out. If my father disappeared for days, I was too difficult and pushed him away. I spent years apologizing for crimes I never committed. "I didn't do anything," I said quietly. My mother laughed coldly. "That's your problem, Evelyn. You never take responsibility." Then Vanessa reached into her purse and pulled out a bracelet. My bracelet. The diamond bracelet my grandmother left me before she died. "I found this in her room," Vanessa said dramatically. "She was probably trying to sell it." I stared at her in disbelief. "You stole that from me." The entire room went silent. My mother stood slowly from her chair. "How dare you accuse your sister after everything we've done for you?" I looked at my father desperately, praying he would finally say something. Defend me once. Just once. But he only rubbed his forehead and sighed like I was exhausting him. That hurt more than the screaming. "You need help," my mother continued. "You're unstable. Jealous. Self-destructive." "That bracelet is mine," I whispered. Vanessa suddenly burst into louder tears. "She scares me." And that was all it took. My mother pointed toward the front door with pure hatred burning in her eyes. Get out. At first I actually laughed because the idea seemed ridiculous. What? You heard me. It's freezing outside. Then maybe you should have thought about that before humiliating this family. I looked at my father again. Nothing. No reaction. No defense. No humanity. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. The servants avoided looking at me, while my mother ordered them to collect my things. I stood there numb while strangers stuffed pieces of my life into garbage bags like I was already dead. Then Vanessa walked close enough for only me to hear her whisper, "You should have disappeared years ago." 10 minutes later, the front door slammed behind me. The freezing wind hit instantly, stealing the air from my lungs. I stumbled down the icy driveway, clutching the trash bag against my chest, while laughter echoed faintly from inside the mansion. They went back to dinner, like I was nothing. My phone battery was almost dead. I had less than $30 in my bank account because my mother controlled the family finances. Most of my friends belonged to Vanessa's social circle, which meant by morning, they'd hear some twisted story about how I had another breakdown. I walked for nearly an hour through empty streets while snow piled on my shoulders. Cars splashed icy water onto the sidewalks as they passed. Nobody looked twice at the girl dragging a trash bag through the storm. Eventually, I stopped outside a closed gas station and sat against the brick wall, trying to stop shaking. That was the first night I truly understood something horrifying. My family wasn't trying to punish me. They were trying to erase me. By morning, I couldn't feel my toes. I'd spent most of the night curled behind the gas station, with my knees against my chest, trying to block the wind cutting through my sweater. Every time headlights passed nearby, I pretended not to notice people staring at me through their windows. A few looked sympathetic. Most looked uncomfortable. None stopped. Around dawn, snow turned into freezing rain, soaking the cardboard beneath me until it practically dissolved into sludge. My entire body ached from shivering. I kept rubbing my hands together so I wouldn't completely lose feeling in them. I never imagined a person could go from sleeping in silk sheets to hiding behind dumpsters in less than 12 hours. The worst part wasn't even the cold. It was realizing nobody was coming for me. Not my father. Not old friends. Not even Vanessa, despite all the fake sisterhood she performed online for years. On social media, she constantly posted captions about family first and women supporting women. Millions of people adored her polished image. If only they knew. My phone finally powered back on for a few seconds after I warmed it beneath my jacket. Dozens of notifications flooded the screen immediately. For one hopeful moment, I thought maybe someone was worried about me. Then I opened social media. Vanessa had already posted a black and white selfie with tears in her eyes. "Sometimes the people you love hurt you the most," the caption read. "Praying for my sister and hoping she gets the help she desperately needs." Thousands of comments poured in underneath. "Stay strong, Vanessa, you don't deserve this. Your sister sounds toxic. Family members like that destroy lives." I stared at the screen in disbelief while rain dripped from my hair onto my hands. She had turned me into the villain overnight. Again. Except this time, I had nowhere left to run. Then another post appeared. A family photo from months earlier. My parents smiling beside Vanessa at some charity event while I stood awkwardly at the edge of the frame. "Family is everything," my mother had captioned it. I laughed so hard it almost sounded insane. The battery died again seconds later. By noon, hunger became impossible to ignore. I hadn't eaten since dinner the night before, and even then I'd barely touched my food because of the tension at the table. My stomach cramped painfully while I wandered through downtown trying to think of somewhere warm to go. I considered calling Daniel for exactly 5 seconds before shutting the idea down completely. Vanessa had already poisoned everyone against me. If I contacted him now, it would only feed whatever lies they were spreading. Besides, I refused to give them the satisfaction of watching me beg. Eventually, I found a small laundromat with fogged-up windows and slipped inside pretending I had clothes to wash. Heat wrapped around me instantly, almost painfully after hours in the cold. An older woman sitting near the dryers glanced at me suspiciously before returning to her magazine. I sat in the corner, hugging my trash bag, while exhaustion dragged at my body. That's when my phone buzzed. 1% battery. Unknown number. For a second, my chest tightened with hope. Maybe my father finally found the courage to call me. Maybe he regretted what happened. I answered immediately. Hello? Soft laughter came through the speaker. Vanessa. Well, she said casually, you sound terrible. I closed my eyes. Why are you calling me? Oh, I just wanted to check if you survived the night. Mom was curious. The way she said Mom made my stomach twist. You stole my bracelet, I whispered. She laughed again. You really still care about that thing? It belonged to Grandma. No, she corrected smoothly. It belonged to the family. Just like the house, the money. Everything you thought was yours. People in the laundromat started glancing at me because my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Why are you doing this to me? There was a long silence before she answered. Because for 1 second, he looked at you instead of me. I frowned. What? Daniel, she snapped, her voice suddenly venomous. Do you know how humiliating it is to date someone who can't stop talking about my sister? Even after all these years, people still compare us. You walk into a room looking miserable and somehow everyone wants to save you. That's not true. It is true, she hissed. You've always had this pathetic little victim act, and people fall for it every time. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't about the bracelet, or the article, or family reputation. Vanessa hated me because she thought my suffering made me more lovable than her perfection. You need help, I said quietly. No, she replied coldly. You need to disappear. Then the line went dead. My phone shut off immediately afterward. I sat there staring at the black screen while something ugly settled inside my chest. Not sadness anymore. Not confusion. Clarity. For years, I kept trying to earn love from people who enjoyed watching me suffer. Every apology I gave only fed them. Every tear made them stronger. Vanessa didn't accidentally ruin my life. She carefully designed it. By evening, the laundromat owner finally approached me. You can't stay here unless you're washing something. I apologized quietly and left before she could threaten to call security. Outside, freezing rain hammered the sidewalks. My clothes were still damp from the night before, and exhaustion made every step feel heavier. I walked aimlessly past expensive restaurants, glowing with warm lights and laughing couples inside. At one point, I caught my reflection in a store window. I barely recognized myself. Dark circles hollowed beneath my eyes. Wet hair clung to my face. My lips had turned pale from cold. I looked exactly like the unstable mess my family wanted the world to believe I was. That realization terrified me more than homelessness itself. Because if you hear lies about yourself long enough, eventually they start sounding true. I ended up near the downtown bus terminal after dark. The waiting area stayed open all night, which meant heat, bathrooms, and temporary safety. Dozens of exhausted strangers filled the benches, runaways, addicts, people carrying their entire lives in backpacks. For the first time in my sheltered existence, nobody cared who my family was. Nobody cared about scandals, wealth, or appearances. To them, I was just another woman trying not to fall apart. I found an empty seat near the vending machines and pulled my knees against my chest again. Across the room, a little girl slept against her mother's shoulder, while the woman stroked her hair protectively. I couldn't stop staring. Because despite everything my family owned, despite all the luxury and status and money, I had never once been looked at like that. Not even as a child. Hours passed slowly. People came and went. Somewhere after midnight, I finally stopped crying. Not because things hurt less. Because something inside me was changing. And for the first time in my life, that change frightened me less than going back home. By the third day, the lies had spread further than I thought possible. Everywhere I went, it felt like my family's version of me had arrived first. I borrowed a charger from a woman at the bus terminal long enough to turn my phone back on again, and that was my mistake. Hundreds of notifications exploded across the screen instantly. Messages from old classmates, former coworkers, random strangers. Most weren't asking if I was okay. They were asking what was wrong with me. Apparently, Vanessa had gone live the night before, crying in front of millions of followers. My mother sat beside her holding her hand while speaking in that calm, polished voice she used for charity interviews. "We've tried everything to help Evelyn," she told the camera sadly. "But sometimes people refuse to save themselves. Save themselves. As if they hadn't thrown me into a snowstorm with nowhere to go. As if they weren't the reason I'd spent 2 nights sleeping around strangers and surviving off vending machine crackers." Vanessa added dramatic pauses between tears while telling viewers how scared she felt around me recently. She implied I'd become unstable, obsessive, and dangerous after losing my job months earlier. The job my mother secretly sabotaged. I watched clips of the live stream while sitting in a public library trying to stay warm. Every comment section looked identical. "Your family deserves peace. She sounds narcissistic. Protect Vanessa at all costs. People like Evelyn destroy everyone around them." My chest tightened so hard it became difficult to breathe. It wasn't just that they lied, it was how easily everyone believed them. I wanted to scream at strangers through the screen. That they had no idea who my family really was. They didn't know my mother once slapped me for speaking during one of her business dinners because I sounded uneducated. They didn't know Vanessa stole from me constantly growing up, then cried until our parents punished me instead. They didn't know my father spent years silently watching everything happen while pretending conflict exhausted him too much to intervene. But the internet only saw beautiful rich women crying on camera. And me? I was the unstable daughter who disappeared. A librarian eventually approached and warned me my quiet crying was disturbing other visitors. I apologized immediately and wiped my face before packing my things. Even that small humiliation felt unbearable now. Every interaction carried this crushing awareness that I no longer belonged anywhere. Outside the library, freezing wind whipped through downtown streets while people hurried past in expensive coats. I walked for nearly an hour without direction until I found myself outside the office building where I used to work. Morgan & Reed, Financial Consulting. 6 months earlier, I'd been a junior analyst there, with a decent salary, my own apartment, and some tiny sense of independence. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Then suddenly, I was fired. Officially, the company claimed performance concerns, despite my evaluations always being excellent. At the time, I thought maybe I truly had failed somehow. My mother repeatedly reminded me that I was too emotional for serious business environments. Now I wondered if that had been another lie too. Before I could stop myself, I walked inside. The receptionist recognized me instantly. Her expression shifted from surprise to discomfort. "Evelyn," she said carefully. "Hi." My voice sounded weak even to me. I need to talk to Mr. Reed for 5 minutes." Her hesitation told me everything before she even answered. "He's busy. Please." She looked around nervously before lowering her voice. "You shouldn't be here right now." Humiliation burned through me. "I just want answers." That's when another familiar voice cut through the lobby. "She deserves them." I turned around sharply. Marcus Reed himself stood near the elevators holding a coffee cup. Mid-50s, perfectly tailored suit, permanently exhausted expression. He stared at me for several seconds before sighing heavily. "Come upstairs." His office overlooked the city skyline, all glass walls and expensive silence. I remained standing because my soaked shoes were leaving faint watermarks on the carpet. Marcus noticed. "You look terrible," he muttered. I almost laughed. Why was I fired? He loosened his tie slowly like he'd been expecting this moment eventually. "Your mother requested it." The room went completely still. "What?" "She's on our board of investors," he explained quietly. "After the situation with Vanessa and Daniel started becoming gossip online, she claimed you were emotionally unstable and creating liabilities for the company." I stared at him in disbelief. "So you fired me because of rumors?" "She threatened to pull millions in funding." My hand started shaking again. You knew it wasn't true. Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Evelyn, your family is powerful. These situations are complicated. No, I snapped softly. They're cruel. He looked away. That silence confirmed everything. My mother didn't just destroy my reputation socially. She systematically removed every piece of independence I had. My job, my credibility, my relationships, my ability to survive without them. And the terrifying part, she did it so elegantly. Nobody questioned her motives. Marcus eventually opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope. I probably shouldn't give you this. Inside was a copy of an email from my mother. The message was short, but devastating. Evelyn is becoming emotionally volatile. For the protection of the company and our family reputation, I strongly recommend immediate termination before her behavior escalates publicly. Attached beneath it were screenshots, private therapy appointments, medication records, personal information only my family had access to. My vision blurred instantly. She sent my medical records, I whispered. Marcus looked ashamed. I assumed you consented. I couldn't even process the betrayal properly anymore. It felt too massive, too endless. Every vulnerable thing I ever shared with my family had become ammunition. Therapy sessions after Grandma died. Anxiety medication during college. Moments I trusted them enough to admit I was struggling. They weaponized all of it. I folded the papers carefully because my fingers had gone numb again. Why are you helping me now? Marcus hesitated before answering. Because yesterday your sister called asking if we'd testify against you publicly if necessary. Cold fear slid through my stomach. What does that mean? She implied there may be legal issues soon. Of course. They weren't satisfied with ruining my life privately anymore. They wanted documentation, public records, permanent proof that I was the family failure. I suddenly understood why Vanessa called me earlier. She wasn't checking if I survived. She was making sure I stayed broken enough not to fight back. Marcus offered me money before I left. I refused it instantly. Not because I wasn't desperate. Because accepting pity from people who helped destroy me felt worse than hunger. When I stepped back outside into the freezing evening air, the city lights blurred around me while traffic roared past endlessly. I clutched the envelope tightly against my chest as realization settled deeper and deeper inside me. My family hadn't impulsively thrown me away. They had been preparing to erase me for months. The fourth night on the streets nearly broke me. By then, exhaustion had become physical pain. My body felt heavy all the time, like every step required more strength than I had left. The cold never truly left either. It buried itself under my skin until even heated buildings couldn't warm me properly anymore. I started understanding why homeless people looked so detached from the world. Survival consumed everything else. I spent most mornings riding city buses back and forth because they were warmer than sitting outside. For a few dollars, I could stay unnoticed for hours. I'd sit near the back pretending to scroll through my dead phone while secretly watching normal people live ordinary lives around me. Students complained about exams. Office workers rushed through emails. Couples argued quietly over groceries and dinner plans. Meanwhile, I was calculating whether I could afford another coffee just to stay inside somewhere for 30 minutes. The humiliation of poverty arrived in layers. At first it was obvious. Things, hunger, cold, dirty clothes. But eventually it became psychological. You stop making eye contact because people either pity you or fear you. You become hyper-aware of security guards watching your movements. You learn which bathrooms are least likely to throw you out. You start apologizing constantly for existing in spaces designed for paying customers. And worst of all, you begin shrinking yourself automatically. One afternoon, I walked into a small bakery downtown because the smell alone made my stomach ache. Fresh bread, cinnamon, coffee. The warmth hit me instantly. I stood near the entrance pretending to check my wallet while secretly counting the few bills I had left. $9, that was everything. A young employee behind the counter smiled politely. Can I help you? I panicked immediately. No, sorry, I'm just waiting for someone. The lie came naturally now. Nobody questioned lonely women waiting for someone. They questioned homeless women with trash bags. I sat near the window for almost an hour, nursing the cheapest black coffee on the menu, while trying not to stare at other people's food. Across from me, a mother cut pancakes into tiny pieces for her toddler, while laughing softly every time syrup ended up on the child's cheeks. Something about that scene hurt more than expected. Not jealousy exactly. Grief. Because I suddenly realized I had no memories like that from my own childhood. No gentle mornings. No safe warmth. Even before my family openly hated me, love inside our house always felt conditional. Controlled. Performative. My mother cared about appearances more than affection. Vanessa cared about competition more than connection. My father cared about avoiding conflict more than protecting anyone. And me? I spent years desperately trying to earn scraps of kindness from people incapable of giving it. The bakery employee approached my table again eventually. This time her smile looked tighter. You've been here a while. I know, I said quietly. I'll leave soon. Her eyes flickered toward my trash bag beside the chair. That look. I was starting to recognize it everywhere. The moment people realize you're not temporarily inconvenienced, you're unwanted. Outside, rain poured heavily across the sidewalks. I walked aimlessly for hours afterward because moving kept my body warmer. My sneakers were permanently soaked by now. Every step squished painfully against my skin, leaving blisters on both heels. Around sunset, I passed a luxury clothing store displaying mannequins dressed in outfits worth more than my remaining money combined. A massive digital billboard above the street suddenly changed advertisements. Vanessa's face appeared instantly. I froze. She smiled down at the city wearing diamonds and a white designer gown while promoting some luxury skincare partnership. Perfect lighting softened her features, while elegant music played from hidden speakers nearby. Confidence is everything. Her voice echoed from the ad. People stopped to admire the billboard. Nobody knew the woman smiling above them had left her own sister homeless. My chest tightened violently. I remembered being 13 years old and helping Vanessa rehearse acceptance speeches in our bedroom mirror, because she dreamed of becoming famous someday. Back then, I genuinely supported her. I defended her against bullies, helped her with homework, covered for her mistakes constantly. I loved her. That was the cruelest part. Even after years of manipulation and betrayal, some broken part of me still missed the version of my sister I kept hoping existed underneath all the cruelty. My phone buzzed suddenly. Unknown number again. For one stupid second, hope flared inside me despite everything. I answered carefully. Hello? This is Detective Harris. My entire body went cold. There's been a complaint filed against you. I stopped walking immediately while rain soaked through my hair. What complaint? Your family claims you've been sending threatening messages to your sister. What? I whispered. We'd like you to come answer a few questions voluntarily. I couldn't even breathe properly anymore. I never threatened anyone. The detective sounded neutral but distant. I'm simply informing you of the report. Of course they did this. Of course they needed authorities involved too. I suddenly pictured Vanessa crying dramatically at a police station while my mother comforted her for cameras and witnesses. They were building a story carefully. Unstable daughter spirals after jealous obsession with successful sister. Every piece fit perfectly. You have the wrong person, I said weakly. Then cooperating shouldn't be an issue. The call ended shortly afterward, leaving me standing alone in the rain, surrounded by strangers rushing past under umbrellas. I wanted to scream. Instead, I kept walking because I didn't know what else to do. Hours later, I ended up near the riverfront where abandoned warehouses lined empty streets. The rain finally slowed into freezing mist, while city lights reflected across dark water. I found partial shelter beneath an old loading dock and sat down against the wall, pulling my knees toward my chest again. That position had become instinct now. Protect vital organs. Preserve warmth. Stay small. A few homeless men occupied the opposite side of the dock, speaking quietly among themselves while drinking from paper cups. One glanced toward me occasionally but didn't approach. I was grateful for that. Fear followed women differently at night. Every passing car made my pulse jump. Every set of footsteps sounded dangerous. I barely slept anymore because survival required constant awareness. At some point after midnight, one of the men walked over slowly holding half a sandwich wrapped in napkins. "You look worse than yesterday," he muttered. I stared at the food silently. He shrugged awkwardly. "Take it or don't." The sandwich was cold turkey on stale bread. Probably leftovers from somewhere. I nearly cried accepting it, not because of hunger. Because it was the first genuine kindness anyone had shown me since my family threw me out. The man returned to his side afterward without asking questions or expecting gratitude. I ate slowly while watching river lights shimmer through darkness, and for the first time in days, something uncomfortable settled inside me. Not hopelessness. Anger. Real anger. Not the helpless crying kind my family dismissed for years. Something colder. Because while I sat freezing beneath abandoned buildings accepting scraps from strangers, Vanessa was probably drinking champagne beside my mother, laughing about how unstable I looked online. And suddenly I couldn't stop thinking about one terrifying possibility. What if they were only able to destroy me because I kept letting them define who I was? A week after my family threw me out, I stopped recognizing myself in mirrors. My face had become thinner. Dark bruises sat permanently beneath my eyes from lack of sleep. My hair stayed tangled no matter how many times I tried fixing it in public restrooms. Every piece of clothing I owned smelled faintly like rainwater, bus stations, and exhaustion. But the strangest change wasn't physical. It was the way people looked through me now. When you're wealthy, the world constantly notices you. Doors open faster. Smiles appear easier. Employees treat you carefully. Even strangers assume your life has value. Lose everything, and suddenly you become invisible. That morning, I sat inside a 24-hour diner near the highway, because the waitress on night shift usually ignored how long I stayed after ordering coffee. The place smelled like burnt bacon and cheap syrup. Neon lights buzzed faintly overhead, while exhausted truck drivers ate silently in nearby booths. I wrapped both hands around a chipped coffee mug just to feel warmth. Across the restaurant, a television played entertainment news at low volume. Vanessa appeared again on screen beside my mother outside some charity luncheon. Reporters surrounded them while cameras flashed endlessly. "She's going through a difficult mental health crisis," my mother told reporters with perfectly controlled sadness. "As a family, we're praying she accepts treatment." I stared at the screen in disbelief. Treatment. They were publicly framing me as unstable now. A headline crawled beneath the interview. "Sochlight family fears for Ndaterne Samuel, but the more Sashmathi after disappearance." Disappearance. Not abandonment. My fingers tightened around the mug so hard the ceramic nearly slipped. The waitress noticed my expression while refilling another customer's coffee. She glanced toward the television, then back at me carefully. "You know them?" For half a second, I considered lying. Then exhaustion answered for me. "That's my family." She blinked. "Seriously?" I nodded once. The woman looked back at the television again, studying Vanessa's crying performance more closely this time. Something shifted in her expression. "You don't look dangerous." I almost laughed. "That's comforting." She hesitated before sliding a basket of untouched fries onto my table. "Kitchen made extra." We both knew that was a lie. "Thank you," I whispered. The waitress gave a small shrug, like kindness embarrassed her. Then she walked away before I could say anything else. I ate slowly, trying not to cry over leftover diner fries. Around noon, the diner grew busier, forcing me to leave before management noticed I'd spent hours there. Outside, gray clouds covered the city, while freezing wind pushed trash along empty sidewalks. I walked downtown again, mostly because movement distracted me from panic. My remaining money had dropped below $5. I'd started checking church shelters and women's centers for places to sleep safely, but most were overcrowded. Some nights I still ended up outside. That afternoon, I ducked into the public library again to warm up. I headed automatically toward the least crowded corner near old business archives where nobody usually bothered me. That's when I noticed him. An older man sat alone at one of the research tables, surrounded by stacks of newspapers and legal documents. Probably late 60s. Silver hair. Worn brown coat, sharp eyes behind thin glasses. He looked strangely familiar. At first, I assumed he was another lawyer or professor doing research. But when I passed nearby, he spoke without even looking up from his papers. "You're Evelyn Laurent." I froze instantly. Fear hit first. My family found me. I stepped backward automatically. "Who are you?" The man finally raised his eyes toward me calmly. "Relax. If I worked for your mother, security would already be here." That didn't comfort me much. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Sit down before you faint." "I'm fine. You're shaking." I hated that he was right. For several seconds, I debated leaving entirely. But exhaustion won again. I sat cautiously while keeping distance between us. The man studied me quietly. "You look like your grandmother." My breath caught. Very few people mentioned grandma anymore. "Did you know her?" "Margaret Laurent saved my career once," he replied. "Long time ago." I stared at him more carefully now. The familiarity finally clicked. Richard Hale. Investigative financial journalist. Years earlier, my grandmother used to read his articles constantly because he specialized in exposing corporate fraud and political corruption. He disappeared from television after some major scandal involving lawsuits from wealthy investors. People like my mother. "What do you want from me?" I asked carefully. Richard leaned back in his chair. "Interesting question. Most people would ask how I found them first." Cold unease slid through me. "How did you find me?" "You've been easier to track than you think." He folded a newspaper slowly. "Your family's media campaign is sloppy." Campaign. The word sounded disturbingly accurate. Richard pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward me. Several articles about my mental breakdown filled the display already. Photos of me leaving restaurants years ago. Anonymous insider quotes. Speculation about addiction issues and emotional instability. "They're manufacturing a narrative," he said calmly. "I know." "No," he corrected. "You understand they're lying. But I don't think you understand the scale." My stomach tightened. Richard slid a folder across the table toward me. Inside were printed business documents, bank transfers, property records, investment filings. I frowned in confusion. "What is this, your family's finances?" I looked up sharply. "Why would you show me this?" "Because your grandmother suspected something before she died." My pulse started hammering instantly. Richard lowered his voice. "Margaret contacted me 3 months before her death, claiming someone inside the family was moving money illegally through offshore accounts." I stared at him speechlessly. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Images flashed through my mind suddenly. My mother screaming at accountants behind closed office doors. My father disappearing during tax season every year. Vanessa bragging online about purchases that never matched her official income. Richard watched realization spread across my face. "Your grandmother believed someone was stealing family assets." "Who?" "That," he said quietly, "is the interesting part." The library suddenly felt colder. I looked down at the documents again while my hands trembled slightly. Numbers blurred together across the pages, but one thing stood out immediately: my name. Several accounts connected to trusts under my inheritance appeared repeatedly throughout the files. "What does this mean?" Richard's expression hardened. "It means your family may not have thrown you away because you were inconvenient." A heavy silence settled between us. "They may have thrown you away because legally you were expensive." I couldn't breathe properly anymore. "No," I whispered automatically. "My mother would never. She already destroyed your reputation publicly within days." Richard interrupted sharply. She leaked private medical records. She isolated you financially. She filed police complaints establishing instability. Every sentence hit harder because it was true. Richard leaned forward slightly. You still think this is about sibling jealousy? For the first time since becoming homeless, genuine fear overtook grief completely. Because suddenly the situation looked different. Bigger. Calculated. Richard tapped the folder once. Your grandmother was trying to protect something before she died. I stared at the papers while cold realization crawled deeper into my chest. And for the first time since sleeping on the streets, I began wondering if my family hadn't just ruined my life. Maybe they were trying to bury evidence with it. I didn't sleep that night. After leaving the library, I spent hours walking through freezing streets with Richard Hale's folder pressed tightly against my chest, like someone might steal it from me. Every few minutes, I stopped beneath streetlights to reread certain pages, hoping I misunderstood the numbers. But the numbers stayed the same. Accounts connected to my inheritance had been emptied gradually over the last 3 years. Transfers moved through shell companies I'd never heard of. Large withdrawals matched dates when Vanessa suddenly upgraded apartments, bought luxury cars, or launched expensive business ventures online. My grandmother's money. My money. Gone. The worst part wasn't even the theft itself. It was realizing how carefully they planned everything while I kept blaming myself for being difficult. By midnight, icy rain started falling again. I ducked beneath the awning of a closed pharmacy and sat against the wall trying to calm my breathing. My mind kept replaying every moment from the past few years, through an entirely different lens now. The sudden firing from my job. My mother insisting I let her temporarily manage Grandma's estate paperwork because I was too emotional after the funeral. Vanessa constantly encouraging me to rest instead of checking financial documents myself. Even my father's silence suddenly looked less passive and more terrified. They weren't simply cruel people enjoying my suffering. They had a reason to keep me weak. A taxi splashed freezing water across the curve nearby, pulling me from my thoughts. I looked down at the folder again, beneath the dim pharmacy light. One page stood out immediately. A trust account created in my name by my grandmother shortly before her death. Estimated value: $14.2 million. My stomach twisted violently. I read the number 3 times because it didn't feel real. 14 million. I thought Grandma only left me jewelry and small investments. That's what my mother told me repeatedly after the funeral. She claimed most of the estate was tied up in business debt and charitable foundations. Another lie. My entire body started trembling, not from cold this time, but rage. I remembered standing beside Grandma's hospital bed during her final week alive while she squeezed my hand weakly and whispered, "Don't let them make you small." At the time, I thought she meant emotionally. Now I wondered if she'd been warning me. I spent the rest of the night at the bus terminal again, pretending to sleep while secretly reading every page Richard gave me. By dawn, exhaustion blurred my vision, but one fact became horrifyingly clear. Someone had been stealing from me for years, and according to these records, the theft accelerated dramatically after Grandma died. Around 8 in the morning, I returned to the library, hoping Richard might still be there. He was. Same table. Same stacks of documents. Same calm expression, like he'd expected me to come back. "You look angry now," he observed quietly. "I want answers." That's healthier than wanting approval. I sat across from him immediately, placing the folder between us. "This account," I said, pointing toward the trust paperwork. "Why didn't I know about this?" "Because someone didn't want you asking questions. That money belongs to me." Richard gave a dry smile. "Legally? Probably. Assuming there's anything left." A sharp wave of nausea hit me. How much did they take? That's difficult to estimate without full records. He adjusted his glasses carefully. But enough to panic if you suddenly regained legal control. I leaned back in the chair slowly, trying to process everything. $14 million. While I slept behind buildings and survived on diner leftovers. The contrast felt almost surreal. They made me homeless while spending my inheritance. Richard studied me for several seconds before answering. "No, They made you homeless because they were spending your inheritance. That sentence changed something permanently inside me. Until then, part of me still emotionally framed myself as a rejected daughter. Some wounded child desperate to understand why her family stopped loving her. But this wasn't emotional dysfunction anymore. It was strategy. My mother isolated me financially because dependence made manipulation easier. Vanessa publicly destroyed my reputation because unstable victims aren't believed. My father stayed silent because silence protected him too. Suddenly, every humiliation looked intentional. "Can I get the money back?" I asked quietly. Richard hesitated. "Possibly. But you have bigger problems first." I frowned. "What bigger problems?" Without answering immediately, he slid another document toward me. A psychiatric evaluation request. Requested by Celeste Laurent. Purpose: emergency conservatorship review. The blood drained from my face instantly. "What is this?" Richard's expression hardened. "Your mother is preparing to declare you mentally unfit." I stared at the paper in horror. No. No, no, no. That's insane. Not if they control the narrative first. My hand started shaking violently again. Conservatorship. If my mother succeeded, she could legally control my finances, medical decisions, and inheritance permanently. After weeks of public rumors about my instability, emotional breakdowns, and disappearance, people might actually believe it. Especially because I looked exactly like someone falling apart. Dirty clothes. Exhaustion. No address. No job. My family created the perfect conditions to discredit me. "They're trying to erase me legally," I whispered. Richard nodded once. "And they're moving fast." Panic surged through my chest so intensely I had to grip the table edge. "What do I do?" "For starters, stop behaving like prey." His tone startled me. Richard leaned forward slightly, voice lowering. "Your family expects desperation, crying, hiding. Maybe addiction eventually." He tapped the folder sharply. "What they won't expect is intelligence." I looked down silently. "You need evidence," he continued. "Financial records, witnesses, timelines, and most importantly, you need to survive long enough to use them." That last sentence hit hard, because until now, survival itself consumed every hour of my life. Food, warmth, shelter, safety. I barely had energy left for revenge fantasies. Richard must have noticed hesitation in my face. "You still love them," he said quietly. I hated how quickly tears burned my eyes. "I don't know what I feel anymore. That confusion is normal." He paused briefly. "Abuse mixed with luxury creates powerful emotional dependency." I looked away immediately. Nobody had ever called my family abusive before. Not directly. People described them as strict, intense, high society perfectionists. But abuse sounded uglier, more real, and terrifyingly accurate. Richard eventually handed me a business card with an address written on the back. "A friend of mine runs temporary apartments for women escaping dangerous situations. Mention my name." I stared at the address carefully. "You're helping me because of Grandma?" "Partly." He gathered papers calmly. "But mostly because powerful people become reckless when they think they've already won." Outside the library later that afternoon, sunlight finally broke through heavy clouds for the first time in days. The city looked almost normal. Again, crowded sidewalks, rushing traffic, strangers carrying coffee cups and shopping bags. Meanwhile, my entire reality had shifted. A week ago, I thought I was a broken daughter abandoned by her family. Now I understood something far worse. I was an obstacle they needed removed before I discovered what they stole from me. For most of my life, I blamed my mother for everything. That was easy. Celeste Laurent was impossible not to notice. She controlled every room she entered with polished smiles and razor-sharp words hidden beneath elegance. People admired her because she looked powerful, sophisticated, untouchable. At home, that same control became something colder. She decided what we wore, who we spoke to, which emotions were acceptable, even how loudly we laughed at dinner. If I cried, she called me dramatic. If I defended myself, I was disrespectful. If I succeeded at something, she reminded me it reflected well on the family, not on me. But my father was harder to understand. Because he wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He was weak. And sometimes weakness destroys people more quietly than cruelty ever could. I thought about him constantly after discovering the truth about the inheritance. Every financial document led back to my mother or Vanessa somehow, but my father's signatures appeared everywhere too. Silent approvals, witnessed transactions, authorization forms. He knew. That realization haunted me more than homelessness. The temporary apartment Richard arranged for me was small but clean. A single room above an old bookstore owned by a widow named Miriam, who asked very few questions. The first night there, I stood under hot water for nearly an hour, because I still couldn't believe warmth was available whenever I wanted it. I cried, washing my hair. Not dramatic movie tears. Quiet, exhausted grief, because once your survival becomes uncertain, ordinary comforts stop feeling ordinary. After showering, I sat wrapped in blankets beside the apartment window, staring at city lights below while rereading the financial documents again. One transfer caught my attention this time. $500,000, authorized jointly by my mother and father 6 months after Grandma's death. Purpose listed. Family stabilization measures. I frowned immediately. That wording sounded deliberately vague. The transfer date triggered something in my memory too. Around that same time, my father suddenly disappeared for almost 3 weeks, claiming he was handling international business issues. When he returned, he looked thinner, quieter, permanently anxious. At the time, I assumed it involved work stress. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I did something I hadn't dared since becoming homeless. I called him. My hands shook dialing the number. Part of me expected immediate rejection. Maybe even another trap. But after 3 rings, he answered softly. "Evelyn?" Hearing his voice nearly broke me. For one horrifying second, I felt like a little girl again, desperate for her father to choose her. "Hi, Dad." Silence stretched painfully between us. "You shouldn't contact us right now," he finally whispered. "Us. Not me. Them." I swallowed hard. "Did Mom tell you not to answer? She's worried about you." I laughed bitterly before I could stop myself. "That's funny. Evelyn." "No." My voice cracked sharply. "I slept outside for days. Did you know that?" He went silent again. That silence answered everything. "You knew," I whispered. "I tried to convince her to let you come home." Home. As if he had no authority there too. Why didn't he stop her? "You don't understand the situation." Anger surged through me instantly. "Then explain it." I heard movement on the other end of the line, like he'd walked into another room. Then his voice dropped lower. "Your mother thinks you've become dangerous." "That's not true." "I know." The word stunned me completely. "You know?" Another long pause followed. "Your mother believes certain things need to stay contained," he said carefully. Contained. He sounded terrified, choosing every word. I stared out the apartment window while cold realization spread through my chest. "You're scared of her." My father exhaled shakily. "You have no idea." That answer changed something inside me permanently. Growing up, I always interpreted his silence as indifference, weakness, cowardice. But fear? That possibility unsettled me deeply. "Dad," I said carefully, "what happened after Grandma died?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, I heard glass clink faintly in the background. Ice cubes. Whiskey probably. My father drank more every year after Grandma passed away. Finally, he spoke again. "Your grandmother threatened to expose things." My pulse quickened. "What things?" "Financial problems. Illegal transfers. Your mother became involved with people she shouldn't have trusted." Every word felt dangerous now. Was she stealing from me? She told herself it was temporary. His voice sounded hollow. Then the debts grew. I gripped the phone tighter. What debts? Again, silence. That silence terrified me more than shouting. She invested heavily after the pandemic, he continued quietly. Luxury developments, offshore partnerships, political favors. When deals collapsed, she started moving money between accounts to cover losses. My inheritance? Yes. The confirmation hit like physical pain. I closed my eyes tightly while years of manipulation rearranged themselves in my mind. My mother wasn't simply greedy. She was drowning financially while maintaining a perfect public image. And I was the easiest account to drain quietly. Why didn't you stop her? My father laughed softly then, a broken, exhausted sound I'd never heard before. Because I already tried once. A chill moved through me. What does that mean? When I confronted her about the money, she threatened to ruin all of us. I frowned. How? She keeps records on everyone. Suddenly memories flooded back. Locked office drawers, hidden safes. My mother recording private conversations constantly for legal protection. At the time it felt obsessive. Now it sounded calculated. She has evidence, my father continued. Tax fraud, affairs, bribes. If she falls, she drags everyone down with her. My stomach twisted. Including him. That's why he stayed silent. Not because he didn't care. Because he was trapped too. You still let her destroy me. The accusation came out quieter than expected. His breathing faltered slightly. I thought she'd calm down eventually. But you watched it happen. I know. Those 2 words carried more guilt than any apology could. Tears burned my eyes suddenly, but anger kept them from falling. I begged you to look at me that night, I whispered. You couldn't even do that. On the other end of the line, my father sounded close to breaking apart himself. If I defended you openly, she would have accelerated everything. What does that mean? She's preparing legal control measures, Evelyn. Conservatorship. He knew about that too. She wants to declare me unstable. Yes. Rage flooded through me again. And you're still protecting her. No, he whispered sharply. I'm trying to keep you alive. The room went completely still. Alive. Not safe. Not protected. Alive. Fear crawled slowly down my spine. What aren't you telling me? Before he could answer, another voice echoed faintly in the background. My mother. Even muffled through the phone, her presence changed the air instantly. Who are you talking to? My father inhaled sharply, then panic entered his voice for the first time. You need to disappear for a while, he whispered quickly. Don't trust family lawyers, don't sign anything. And whatever happens, do not let your mother know what you've discovered. Dad, she thinks you're weak, he interrupted urgently. Stay that way until you're ready. Then the line disconnected. I stared at the dead phone in silence while my heartbeat thundered against my ribs. Outside, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows, while traffic lights reflected across wet streets below. The room suddenly felt smaller, unsafe. Because for the first time in my life, I understood something horrifying about my father. He never defended me because he wasn't protecting the family from conflict. He was protecting himself from my mother. 3 days after my call with my father, I went back to my grandmother's house for the first time since the funeral. Technically, the property no longer belonged to her. My mother sold it less than a year after Grandma died, claiming the memories were too painful to keep around. But I always suspected she sold it quickly because Grandma's presence lingered there in ways my mother couldn't control. The new owners were renovating the estate, which meant workers moved in and out constantly. Richard helped me find that information through public property records. According to him, if Grandma hid anything important before her death, there was a good chance nobody had discovered it yet. Especially if they didn't know where to look. I stood across the street that morning wearing borrowed clothes from Miriam's apartment donations and a baseball cap pulled low over my face. Construction trucks lined the driveway while workers carried wooden equipment through the front entrance. The mansion looked smaller somehow. Growing up, it always felt enormous. Endless hallways, polished staircases, antique chandeliers, paintings worth more than most people's homes. But standing outside now, stripped of childhood illusions, I saw what it really was. A monument to appearances. My grandmother was the only person who ever made the house feel warm. Every Sunday morning she baked cinnamon bread herself despite having staff available. She hated eating alone, so she'd invite me into the kitchen while everyone else slept late. Sometimes we talked for hours about books, history, or random stories from her youth before the Laurent family became wealthy. Other times we sat quietly together while music played softly from her old radio. Those mornings saved me more than she ever knew. I slipped through the side garden entrance while workers focused on the backyard renovation. My pulse hammered violently with every step. If someone recognized me, security would probably remove me immediately. But fear mattered less now than answers. Inside, the house smelled different. Dust, fresh paint, exposed wood. Most furniture had already been removed, leaving rooms hollow and unfamiliar. Sunlight filtered through tall windows onto floors where my childhood memories still lingered like ghosts. I moved carefully toward Grandma's old bedroom upstairs. The room was almost empty, except for covered furniture and stacked renovation supplies. Workers had stripped wallpaper from one wall already, exposing cracked plaster beneath. Seeing strangers dismantle her space felt deeply wrong somehow. I walked slowly toward the closet. Grandma once told me people reveal themselves through what they keep hidden, not what they display publicly. At the time, I thought she meant emotionally. Now I understood she may have meant literally. Most shelves stood empty except for dust outlines where boxes used to sit. My chest tightened with disappointment until I noticed something strange near the back corner. A loose wooden panel. I crouched immediately, pulling it aside carefully. Behind it sat a small metal lockbox covered in dust. My heartbeat nearly stopped. Hands trembling, I dragged the box into the light. It wasn't locked anymore, probably because Grandma knew someone she trusted would eventually find it. Me. Inside were old photographs, legal papers, handwritten notes, and a tiny brass key taped beneath the lid. I stared at the contents in disbelief. Grandma knew. She knew something was wrong before she died. The photograph showed my mother meeting unfamiliar men outside hotels and office buildings over several years. Some looked like politicians. Others looked dangerous in ways difficult to explain, expensive suits hiding colder expressions. Beneath the photos sat printed bank statements covered with Grandma's handwritten annotations in red ink. Unhauterized. Not approved. Check veinsa transfer. My breathing quickened. Then I found the letter. It was sealed in an envelope with my name written across the front in Grandma's elegant handwriting. Evelyn. Just seeing her writing almost made me cry. I opened the envelope carefully. If you are reading this, it means I waited too long to protect you properly. Your mother is not simply irresponsible, she is desperate. Desperate people justify terrible things when they believe status matters more than morality. I fear she has involved Vanessa in financial crimes neither of them fully understand. And your father, God forgive him, lacks the courage to stop any of it. The room blurred slightly as tears filled my eyes. For months I questioned my sanity because my family kept insisting I was unstable, dramatic, emotional. Meanwhile, Grandma saw the truth the entire time. The letter continued. You were always different from them. That difference made you dangerous to people who survived their manipulation. They mistake kindness for weakness because they cannot imagine anyone choosing integrity over power. If anything happens to me, there is additional evidence hidden where your mother would never willingly look. Use the brass key. I stared at the tiny key in my palm. Additional evidence. Footsteps suddenly echoed somewhere downstairs. I froze instantly. Workers. Voices moved through the hallway below while adrenaline surged through my body. I shoved everything back into the lockbox quickly except the letter and key, which I slipped into my jacket pocket. The footsteps came closer. Without thinking, I slid beneath Grandma's old bed frame just seconds before two workers entered the room carrying paint supplies. "You think rich people ever get happy?" one man asked casually while setting equipment down. The other laughed. "Not if this place is any proof." I lay perfectly still beneath the bed while dust coated my hands and knees. My heart pounded so hard I worried they'd hear it. The workers stayed nearly 20 minutes discussing renovations before finally leaving again. Only after their footsteps disappeared downstairs did I crawl out slowly. My entire body shook now. Partly fear, partly adrenaline, partly realization. Grandma had been secretly documenting my family before her death. Not because she disliked them, because she feared them. I grabbed the lockbox again and searched quickly for anything connected to the brass key. Near the bottom, I found another handwritten note. Storage, Unit 214. Westbrook Storage. My pulse quickened immediately. Storage unit. More evidence. Before leaving, I glanced around Grandma's empty bedroom one last time. Sunlight touched the walls softly while renovation noises echoed faintly through the house below. For one painful moment, I imagined what life could have been if she survived longer. Maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe someone would have finally stood between me and my family before everything collapsed. But deep down, I knew the truth. My grandmother understood exactly how dangerous they were becoming. That's why she prepared for war before she died. Outside the mansion, cold winds swept through the streets while I walked away clutching the letter tightly inside my jacket. Construction noise faded behind me, replaced by the distant sounds of traffic and city life continuing normally around me. Meanwhile, everything inside my world had shifted again. Because buried inside Grandma's hidden box wasn't just proof of financial theft. It was confirmation that my family had been hiding secrets far darker than stolen money. The address on the note storage unit 214. Westbrook Storage kept repeating in my mind, like a warning I couldn't silence. I didn't go there immediately. Something about it felt heavier than the lockbox, heavier than the documents, heavier than even the truth about my inheritance. It felt like the kind of place where answers don't just reveal themselves. They change everything you thought you understood about your own family. That night, I couldn't sleep inside Miriam's apartment. I kept pacing the small room, staring at the brass key Grandma had hidden inside her box. It was simple, old, almost meaningless in appearance. But I kept thinking about her handwriting, steady even while she was dying, instructing me where to go as if she had planned this long before anyone realized the family was falling apart. At sunrise, I left. Westbrook Storage was on the edge of the city, where residential streets slowly turned into industrial roads lined with warehouses and forgotten lots. The air smelled different there, less like life, more like rust and dust and things people don't come back for. I stood outside the gate for several minutes before entering. The security guard barely looked at me when I signed in. To him, I was just another person renting temporary space. That invisibility used to terrify me. Now it was useful. Unit 214 was on the second row, halfway down a dim corridor of metal doors. Each step I took echoed louder than it should have. My fingers tightened around the brass key so hard it almost hurt. When I reached the door, I stopped. For a moment, I couldn't move. This was the point of no return. Whatever was inside would either confirm everything I suspected or destroy the last remaining version of my family I still subconsciously clung to. I exhaled shakily and inserted the key. The lock clicked open instantly. Inside, the air smelled stale, untouched for years. Dust floated in the weak light, spilling from the open door. The unit wasn't large, but it was filled, carefully organized, intentional. Not abandoned. Boxes lined the walls. Some were labeled in my grandmother's handwriting again. Others were unlabeled entirely. My hands shook as I stepped inside. The first box I opened contained financial ledgers. Not just copies of accounts I had already seen, but deeper records, transactions routed through companies I had never heard of. Some of the entries were highlighted in red ink again. Grandma's markings. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was tracking patterns. I moved to the next box, then the next. Each one revealed something worse. Contracts tied to offshore investments. agreements involving land purchases under false names, documents referencing asset redistribution that had nothing to do with legal inheritance procedures. And then I found photographs. These weren't like the ones in her bedroom, these were taken secretly. My mother meeting different people in underground parking garages, hotel back entrances, private clubs, I recognized only by reputation. My father appeared in some of them too, standing slightly behind her, never leading, always watching. But the most disturbing images were the ones involving Vanessa. She wasn't just present at events. She was learning. In one photo, she stood beside my mother reviewing documents with a man in a black suit. In another, she was signing papers while laughing, as if it were all a game. My stomach twisted violently. This wasn't ignorance. This was training. My sister wasn't just benefiting from stolen wealth. She was being prepared to continue it. I sat down heavily on the dusty floor, my back against the boxes while the reality settled deeper into my chest. My family wasn't falling apart emotionally like I once believed. They were structured, organized, systematic, and I had been removed because I didn't fit into that structure. A sound echoed faintly outside the unit, and I froze instantly, listening. Footsteps, slow, controlled, coming closer. I quickly shoved the photographs back into the box and stood, wiping dust from my hands. My heart pounded violently as the footsteps stopped near the entrance. A shadow appeared under the doorframe. Then a voice. "You found it, didn't you?" My entire body went cold. Richard Hale stepped into view calmly, hands in his coat pockets, as if this was an ordinary meeting, and not a moment that could change everything. "You followed me," I said sharply. "I checked the rental records after you left the library," he replied simply. "You were never subtle." My pulse was still racing. "What is all this?" He glanced around the storage unit slowly, taking in the boxes without surprise. "Confirmation." I frowned. "You already knew?" "Not all of it," he corrected. "But enough to connect patterns." I shook my head in disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" "Because truth without structure gets you killed or discredited," he said calmly. "Your family is not just defensive, they're strategic. And right now, they believe you're still confused and alone." I looked down at the open boxes again. "I am alone." Richard's expression softened slightly. "Not anymore." That sentence should have comforted me. It didn't. Instead, it made everything feel more real. He stepped closer and pointed at a thick folder inside the unit. "That one." I opened it slowly. Inside were legal drafts, corporate restructuring plans, and a name that made my breath catch instantly. Laurent Holdings Trust Reassignment Protocol. "What is this?" I whispered. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he waited until I turned another page. That's when I saw it. A full organizational chart. At the top, my mother, below her, Vanessa, below them, me. My position wasn't marked as heir, it was marked as liability containment. My vision blurred slightly. "They didn't just remove me from inheritance," I said quietly. Richard nodded once. "They repositioned you as a risk factor." I stared at the chart for a long time. Everything suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. My homelessness wasn't random. My reputation wasn't accidental. Even the timing of my job loss, the legal pressure, the rumors online, all of it aligned perfectly with preparation for something larger. They weren't just erasing me socially. They were preparing a structure where I legally could not interfere with what they were building. A new inheritance system. A new power chain. Without me in it. I looked at Richard slowly. "What happens if I fight this?" He didn't hesitate. "Then they escalate." Outside the storage unit, wind rattled the metal door softly, like the world itself was reminding me how fragile my position was. Richard watched me carefully. "But they made one mistake," he added. I looked up. "They assumed you stayed the same person they discarded." I held the organizational chart tighter in my hands. For the first time since everything began collapsing, something inside me didn't feel like fear. It felt like recognition. Not of who I was before, but of what I was becoming now that I finally understood the shape of the cage they built around me. After leaving the storage unit, I didn't go back to Miriam's apartment immediately. I couldn't. Something inside me had shifted too violently to return to anything that still resembled normal life. The documents, the photographs, the organizational chart, it all kept replaying in my mind like a loop I couldn't shut off. Every detail now felt connected, like pieces of a structure I had been standing inside my entire life without realizing it was designed to trap me. I walked for hours that day, not because I was lost, but because movement kept me from breaking down in public. The city looked unchanged around me, cars moving, people talking, shops opening and closing. But I felt completely separated from it, like I had crossed into a version of reality where everything familiar had been quietly replaced with something colder and more intentional. By evening, I ended up sitting on the steps of an old closed cinema in a quieter part of the city. The building was abandoned, its marquee flickering with half-dead lights advertising movies that were no longer playing. I sat there for a long time, watching strangers pass by without noticing me. That used to hurt. Now it clarified things. Because invisibility wasn't just something that happened to me anymore. It was something I understood how to use. Richard's words echoed again in my head. They assumed you stayed the same person they discarded. For the first time since being thrown out, I asked myself a question I had avoided completely. What if I stopped trying to survive like their victim? What if I started thinking like their problem? That night, I didn't cry. Not once. Instead, I went back to Miriam's apartment and spread all the documents across the small wooden table. The room filled quickly with paper bank records, legal drafts, photographs, handwritten notes from my grandmother. I studied everything carefully, line by line, not as emotional trauma anymore, but as structure. Patterns began to emerge. My mother wasn't just hiding money. She was redirecting it through multiple entities that all circled back into a central trust structure. Vanessa's businesses weren't independent either. They were extensions of the same system, each one designed to move assets without attracting attention. Even my father's involvement now looked different. He wasn't simply silent. He was a recorded witness, a necessary signature in too many places to be accidental. By midnight, I realized something that made my chest tighten. This wasn't a broken family. This was a functioning operation. And I had been the only variable they couldn't control. Around 2 a.m, exhaustion finally forced me to stop. I sat back in the chair, staring at the scattered evidence, feeling something unfamiliar building slowly inside me. Not sadness, not fear. Focus. For years I believed my role in the family was passive, someone who reacted, suffered, adapted. But looking at everything now, I started to see it differently. I wasn't just excluded. I was strategically removed. Because as long as I existed unaware, I could be managed. But now I wasn't unaware anymore. That realization didn't feel empowering at first. It felt dangerous. The next morning, Richard contacted me again. We met at a small cafe near the edge of the financial district. It was the kind of place where people worked on laptops, discussed deals quietly, and never looked twice at anyone sitting alone. Richard arrived earlier than me and already had coffee waiting. "You didn't sleep," he observed immediately. "I couldn't," I replied. He studied my face for a moment, then slid a folder toward me. "This is what I found overnight." Inside were expanded financial trails connected to the trust structures. But this time, there were annotations beside certain transactions. Risk classification, Evelyn Laurent exposure potential. Threat mitigation, reputational containment. My stomach tightened instantly. "They're labeling me like a liability report," I said quietly. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "Because that's how they operate now." I stared at the document longer, this time without emotional reaction. Something about it felt different now. Less like betrayal. More like confirmation of a system I was finally starting to understand. "They're preparing something," I said. Richard nodded. "A final restructuring phase." I looked up immediately. "What does that mean?" "They consolidate everything," he said calmly. assets, control, legal protection. And once it's done, they eliminate remaining vulnerabilities. I felt my pulse slow slightly instead of speeding up. And I'm the vulnerability. You're the last unresolved factor, he corrected. A silence settled between us. For the first time, I wasn't imagining revenge emotionally anymore. I was analyzing structure. If they finalize this, I asked slowly, what happens to me? Richard didn't sugarcoat it. You become irrelevant legally, then socially, then financially. Eventually, you either disappear willingly, or you're removed through force or documentation. The way he said it wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, like a system update. I looked down at the coffee in front of me. My reflection trembled faintly on its surface. So I either accept being erased, I said, or I stop it. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly. That depends on what you're willing to become. That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. Because up until that moment, I had still been thinking in terms of truth, justice, exposure. But sitting there, watching people around me type emails and negotiate deals like normal life was happening just outside my collapse. I started to understand something uncomfortable. Truth alone wasn't enough. My family didn't survive on truth. They survived on control. And control required disruption, not explanation. After leaving the cafe, I didn't return to hiding. I went instead to a public business center and requested access to archived corporate records under a false name Richard helped me prepare. It took hours of waiting, but eventually I was given limited access to older filings connected to Lauren Holdings. What I found changed everything again. Buried in older documents were references to a secondary trust structure my grandmother had attempted to establish shortly before her death. It was designed specifically to prevent internal family consolidation of assets. But it was never finalized. The signature was missing. My mother's signature. Which meant one thing. My grandmother had tried to block her. And failed. I closed the file slowly, realizing something terrifying. Everything I had discovered so far wasn't just about theft or manipulation. It was about unfinished resistance. My grandmother hadn't just left me evidence. She had left me a position inside an ongoing conflict that never ended with her death. And whether I wanted it or not, I was now standing in the middle of it. I stopped sleeping in safe places after that. The realization that my family wasn't just hiding money but actively restructuring an entire system around my removal changed how I moved through the world. Miriam's apartment no longer felt like shelter. It felt temporary, like staying too long would make me predictable again. Predictability was dangerous now. Richard noticed the shift before I even said anything. You're thinking differently, he said one evening when we met again near the financial district. I'm thinking clearly, I replied. He didn't argue. Instead, he handed me a new set of documents. This is what you asked for, he said. It was a deeper mapping of Landlord holding shell companies, subsidiary trusts, offshore accounts, and internal communication references between my mother and Vanessa. But this time, something else was included. Employee-level movement records, security logs, access histories. What am I looking at? I asked. Patterns of physical presence, he said. Who was where and when? I scanned the pages quickly. Then I stopped. My father's name appeared repeatedly at specific properties and meetings that were never publicly acknowledged, not as an owner, but as an attendee. A witness, a silent participant, but there was something worse. Every time major financial adjustments were made under my inheritance account, he was physically present within 24 hours. My throat tightened slightly. He wasn't just signing papers, I said slowly. No, Richard confirmed. He was present when decisions were made. That changed everything again, because presence meant awareness, and awareness meant choice. That night, I couldn't return to sleep. Instead, I walked through quieter parts of the city until I found a small 24-hour internet cafe. It was dim, filled with old computers and people trying to avoid cold weather more than anything else. I rented a terminal for an hour and started building something I had never built before. A timeline. Not emotional. Not personal. Factual. Every major event from the past 5 years. Grandma's death, my job loss, Vanessa's rise, financial transfers, public scandals mapped side by side with corporate movements and legal filings. Patterns emerged quickly. Too quickly. There were no random incidents. Everything aligned. My removal from my job coincided with a liquidity shift in offshore accounts. My public reputation collapse coincided with a legal restructuring phase. Vanessa's sudden wealth increases matched asset movement spikes from accounts tied to my inheritance. Even my homelessness aligned with the final documentation phase preparing for legal conservatorship. I sat back in the chair slowly. This wasn't chaos. This was sequencing. Someone had planned this in stages. And I was the final step. When I left the internet cafe, it was nearly morning. Cold air hit my face instantly, but I didn't feel it the same way anymore. Physical discomfort had become background noise compared to the structure forming in my mind. By midday, Richard called me again. "We need to meet," he said. His voice sounded different. More urgent. We met at a different location, this time an empty office floor, inside a partially rented building Richard had access to through a contact. He closed the door behind me immediately. "They accelerated the process," he said without preamble. I frowned. "What process?" "Conservatorship filing," he replied. "It's been officially submitted." My body went cold instantly. "When?" "Yesterday." I stared at him. That meant my father's warning hadn't been abstract. It had been immediate. "They're moving to take legal control," I said quietly. "Yes." I sat down slowly in one of the chairs. "What happens now?" Richard leaned against the table. "Now it becomes a legal battle." I looked up sharply. "I don't have lawyers. I don't have anything." "That's not entirely true," he said. He slid another folder toward me. Inside were contacts. Legal firms. Financial auditors. And one name circled in red ink. Former Trustee Oversight Council. "Why this one?" I asked. "Because they previously investigated your grandmother's concerns," Richard said. "Before everything was shut down." My chest tightened slightly. So she wasn't alone. "No," he said. "But she was isolated." I stared at the paper for a long moment. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding since this started. "Can I win this?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied me carefully. "You're asking the wrong question." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're assuming this is about winning or losing." I stayed silent. He continued. "This isn't a dispute anymore. It's a containment strategy. Your family isn't trying to defeat you. They're trying to finalize your irrelevance legally." The words hit harder than expected. "Irrelevance," I repeated quietly. "Yes," he said. "Because irrelevant people don't require confrontation." I looked down at my hands. For years, I thought my problem was emotional being, unwanted, misunderstood, discarded. But this was structural. Systematic exclusion designed to erase impact, not just presence. "So what do I do?" I asked again. Richard didn't hesitate this time. "You stop reacting," he said, "and start positioning." That word stuck with me. Positioning. Not survival. Not escape. Positioning. That night, I didn't go back to hiding. Instead, I began mapping something new. Not their system this time. Mine. I started identifying everything they had overlooked. Every document they assumed I didn't understand. Every financial trail they believed was too complex for someone like me to follow. Every legal vulnerability that existed because they never considered I would stop being emotional and start being precise. Hours passed without me noticing. At some point, I realized something unsettling. I wasn't just learning how they operated. I was beginning to think like them. And that terrified me more than anything else. So far, I saw her at a distance before she saw me. Vanessa. She was leaving a high-end boutique on a main shopping avenue, dressed in soft beige luxury layers, Sunglasses tilted perfectly even though the sun wasn't strong. Two assistants followed behind her carrying branded bags like they were part of her shadow. I stopped walking immediately. Not because I was scared, because my body reacted before my mind did. It had been weeks since I last saw her in person, but nothing about her appearance suggested guilt, struggle, or even awareness that my life had collapsed while hers expanded. She moved through the street like someone untouched by consequence. For a moment, I just watched her. Then I realized something unsettling. She didn't look for me, not even once. That confirmed Richard's words in a way nothing else had. They truly believed I was gone. Or irrelevant. I stepped into the crowd slowly, keeping distance, letting people pass between us like natural cover. My clothes were simple now, borrowed and neutral, nothing that would draw attention. I had learned how to disappear into normality on purpose. Vanessa stopped outside a cafe and checked her phone. I moved closer. Close enough to hear fragments of her conversation when she answered a call. "Yes, Mom, I already handled it," she said casually, voice soft but confident. "The lawyer said she can't contest it without stable residence proof." A pause. Then she smiled faintly. "No, she hasn't contacted anyone important. She's still floating around apparently." I felt my stomach tighten. Floating around. That's what I had become in their narrative. Not a person, not a missing daughter, just a drifting problem with no fixed position. Vanessa laughed lightly at something on the call. "I told you, she won't fight it properly. She never does." My hands curled slowly into fists. I could have stepped forward right then. I could have confronted her in the middle of the street, screamed everything I knew, forced her to look at me as I actually was, instead of the version they had created. But something inside me stopped it. Not fear. Calculation. Richard's voice echoed in my mind again. Stop reacting. Start positioning. So I didn't move. Instead, I followed her. Not closely. Not obviously. Just enough distance to remain unseen while she moved through her day like nothing had changed. She went from the cafe to a private office building downtown. I waited outside across the street, observing entrances, security patterns, timing. She stayed inside for nearly 2 hours. When she came out, her expression was sharper, focused. She wasn't just shopping anymore. She was working. That detail mattered more than I expected. Vanessa got into a black car waiting at the curb. I memorized the plate number before it drove off. Then I went back to Richard. He was waiting in the same temporary office space, surrounded by printed files and screens showing financial timelines. He looked up immediately when I entered. "You saw her," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." I handed him the plate number. He typed it into a system quietly, then leaned back slightly after a few seconds. "Private corporate transport," he said. "Registered under a holding subsidiary tied to your mother." I nodded slowly. "She's actively involved in business operations now," I said. "She has been for a while," Richard corrected. That realization hit harder than expected. Vanessa wasn't just benefiting anymore. She was participating. Richard pulled up another document on his screen and turned it toward me. "This is what you need to understand," he said. It was a legal workflow chart. My name sat at the bottom again. But this time arrows connected multiple departments toward me. Legal, financial, public relations, risk management, all converging. "She's central to the case now," I said quietly. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "They've shifted you from background liability to active legal target." I looked up sharply. "Meaning?" "Meaning they're preparing to justify control over your identity in court," he said. "Not just finances anymore. Your decisions, your credibility, your autonomy." My throat tightened slightly. "They're trying to make me legally non-existent," I said. "Controlled," he corrected. "Not non-existent. Controlled existence is more useful." That distinction made my skin feel cold. I sat down slowly across from him. "I saw her laughing," I said quietly. Richard looked at me. "She thinks she's already won." I nodded. "I know." A silence settled between us for a moment. Then Richard said something unexpected. "She noticed you, didn't she?" I looked up. My hesitation was enough answer. "Yes," I admitted. "Did she react?" I thought back carefully. Not fear, not shock. Just a slight pause in her movement, like recognizing something inconvenient. "She didn't care," I said finally. Richard nodded slowly. "That's important." I frowned. "Why?" "Because people who are confident and controlled don't register threats emotionally," he explained. "They register them procedurally." I didn't fully understand. He continued. "If she saw you as dangerous, she would have reacted emotionally. Fear, panic, disruption. But if she saw you as a variable, she processed you differently." My stomach tightened again. "A variable," I repeated. Yes, that word stayed with me longer than anything else. Not daughter, not sister, not person. Variable. That night, I didn't sleep again. Instead, I replayed every moment of following Vanessa, analyzing her movements the way Richard analyzed financial data. Her patterns weren't random either. Every location had purpose. Every conversation had direction. She wasn't living freely. She was operating inside a system too. Just a different role. And that realization changed something fundamental in how I saw everything. The next morning, I made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I went back to the city center alone. Not to confront her. Not to hide. But to observe again. Because for the first time since everything collapsed, I wasn't trying to survive my family anymore. I was starting to study them. I stopped running from them after that day. Not physically. Emotionally. Because something changed in the way I saw Vanessa, my mother, even my father. They were no longer distant figures controlling my life from a mansion I was locked out of. They were patterns. Systems. Predictable reactions inside a structure I was finally beginning to understand. Richard called it positioning. I started calling it observation. The first time I deliberately entered their space again, it wasn't dramatic. No confrontation. No hidden agenda that would immediately expose me. Just presence. I went to a public financial registry office under a borrowed identity Richard helped me construct. It wasn't illegal in appearance, but it gave me access to corporate filings tied to Laurent Holdings and its subsidiaries. I sat in front of a terminal for nearly 4 hours that day. Not crying. Not shaking. Just watching. Reading. Comparing. And slowly building something inside my mind that felt less like emotion and more like structure. Every transaction tied to my inheritance had layers. Every layer had justification. Every justification had paperwork designed to look legitimate if anyone questioned it. But legitimacy wasn't the same as truth. And my family relied heavily on people confusing the two. By afternoon, I found something new. A consultancy contract signed under Vanessa's name. It wasn't just wealth redistribution anymore. She was formally attached to operational decision-making now. Not symbolic. Active. My sister wasn't just the smiling public face anymore. She was inside the system. That realization sat heavier than I expected, because it meant something simple and terrifying at the same time. She understood everything. Or at least enough of it. I left the registry office with a copy of the documents and walked for a long time without direction again. The city didn't feel unfamiliar anymore. It felt layered. Every building, every corporate tower, every cafe suddenly looked like part of a larger machine I had been standing outside my entire life without noticing its gears. That evening, Richard met me in a different location again, this time a quieter office space with no windows. He looked at the documents without speaking for several minutes. "You're catching up faster than expected," he finally said. "I don't have the luxury of not understanding anymore," I replied. He nodded slowly. "That's usually when people become dangerous." I didn't respond immediately, because I was starting to understand what he meant. Dangerous didn't mean emotional anymore. It meant informed. Richard slid another file toward me. "This is what changed today," he said. Inside was a legal motion draft. filed under emergency conservatorship expansion. My mother's name was at the top again. But this time, Vanessa's name appeared as coaffiant. My breath tightened slightly. She signed it, I said quietly. Yes. I looked up at him. That means she's not just participating anymore. She's aligned. Richard studied me carefully. She's been aligned for a while. That sentence landed differently than the others, because I had spent years framing Vanessa as the emotional sibling. The manipulative one, yes, but still reactive. Still driven by insecurity or jealousy. But alignment meant intention. It meant structure. It meant she wasn't following my mother blindly anymore. She had chosen her position inside the system. I leaned back in the chair slowly. So this isn't just my mother, I said. No, Richard replied. It never was. That realization shifted something deeper inside me. For a long time, I had believed I was being erased by one dominant figure in the family, but now I saw a network instead. A coordinated structure where each person had a role. My mother controlled authority. Vanessa controlled narrative. My father controlled silence. And I was the disruption they had all learned to neutralize together. The more I understood it, the less personal it felt. And that was dangerous in a different way. Because detachment made planning easier. Richard noticed the change in my expression. You're thinking ahead, he said. Yes. Good. He tapped the file lightly. Then you need to understand the next stage. I looked at him. What stage? They're preparing public validation, he said. Court-backed documentation to reinforce the conservatorship narrative. I frowned slightly. Meaning what exactly? Meaning they will present you as legally unstable with multiple supporting sources. My stomach tightened again. Doctors, lawyers, witness statements. He nodded. All curated. I sat still for a moment. They're building a case, I said quietly. Yes, to prove I'm unfit. Correct. I looked down at the documents again, and for the first time, I understood the true shape of what I was facing. This wasn't just financial theft. It wasn't just emotional betrayal. It was legal construction. A carefully assembled version of reality where I no longer existed as an independent entity. And the terrifying part wasn't the scale of it. It was how normal it must look from the outside. Richard leaned forward slightly. There's something else, he said. I looked up immediately. He hesitated for a second before continuing. Your mother is accelerating timelines because someone outside the family is beginning to ask questions. My pulse quickened slightly. Who? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he placed another document on the table. A media inquiry request from a financial investigative outlet. My eyes narrowed. That's not your doing, I said. No, Richard replied. Someone else has started connecting patterns independently. I stared at the paper longer. That changed the equation again. Because external attention meant unpredictability. And unpredictability meant risk for them. For the first time, I realized I wasn't the only variable in motion anymore. There were others watching. I folded the paper slowly. So what happens now? I asked. Richard looked at me for a long moment. Now they either finalize control quickly, he said, or they start losing it publicly. The room felt quieter after that. I stood up slowly, collecting the documents. I saw Vanessa again, I said suddenly. Richard looked up. She didn't react like she used to, I continued. She looked at me like I was already part of something irrelevant. He nodded once. Then she understands positioning too. I didn't like how that sounded. Because it meant Vanessa wasn't just an opponent. She was trained, structured, intentional, just like the system itself. And that meant the confrontation I had been unconsciously imagining for weeks was never going to look like a dramatic moment between sisters. It was going to be something else entirely, something far more controlled, and far more dangerous than emotion ever was. I stopped thinking of my family as people after that. Not because I stopped caring completely, but because emotional framing no longer matched what I was seeing in the documents. Every new file Richard gave me, every record I accessed through the registry system, every trace of financial movement tied back to the same conclusion. This was not a chaotic family collapse. It was a coordinated system of concealment. And I was the only part of it that had become unpredictable. The turning point came when Richard handed me a new set of transaction logs tied to offshore restructuring accounts. At first, they looked like routine financial adjustments, common for wealthy families trying to minimize tax exposure and maintain liquidity across jurisdictions. But then I noticed the pattern. Every time a major asset shift occurred under my inheritance structure, there was a corresponding private meeting logged under a separate entity linked to my mother's advisory network. And within 48 hours of those meetings, Vanessa's public-facing ventures would expand, rebrand, or suddenly receive funding injections. Nothing was random, everything was synchronized. I sat in the small office, staring at the screen for a long time without speaking. Richard didn't interrupt me. He had learned by now that I processed things differently when I stopped reacting emotionally. Finally, I spoke. "She's not just stealing from me," I said quietly. "No," he replied. "She's converting you." I looked at him sharply. He leaned back slightly. "Your existence in the system is being transformed from beneficiary to liability trigger," he explained. "Everything they do now is designed to ensure your claims, if raised, are automatically invalidated." The words sounded clinical, but their meaning was devastating. It meant I wasn't just being erased. I was being pre-discredited. I opened another file. This one contained recorded internal communications between legal advisors tied to Laurent Holdings. Most of it was coded language, but certain phrases repeated often enough to stand out. Preemptive stabilization, risk narrative containment, family continuity assurance. Each phrase sounded harmless alone. Together, they formed something else entirely. A strategy. I closed the file slowly. "They've been preparing for this for years," I said. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "Your grandmother interrupted the timeline." That caught my attention immediately. "What do you mean interrupted?" He handed me another document. It was an old draft of a revised inheritance protection structure. My grandmother's name appeared as the initiator. The goal was clear: separate operational control from emotional beneficiaries, preventing internal exploitation. But the document was never finalized. There was a missing approval signature. My mother's. Which meant everything had collapsed at that point. I stared at the page. "So she stopped it," I said. "She delayed it," Richard corrected. "Then adapted it." A cold realization formed in my chest. "By using me." He nodded once. The room felt suddenly smaller. Every memory I had of being sidelined, dismissed, or emotionally undermined began to align with something far more structured. It wasn't just favoritism or control issues. It was operational necessity. I was never meant to be an equal participant in their system. I was meant to be managed. And when I stopped being manageable, they escalated. I leaned forward slowly. "What is the end goal of all this?" I asked. Richard hesitated slightly before answering. "Complete consolidation," he said. "Control of assets, narrative, and legal authority under a unified decision structure. And I stand in the way of that." "Yes." The simplicity of his answer was almost worse than anything else. I looked down at my hands. For years, I thought my family's behavior was personal. Now I understood it was structural. That realization should have made it easier to detach. But instead, it made everything sharper. Because structures can be analyzed. And systems can be broken. That night, I didn't go back to Miriam's apartment. Instead, I stayed in the same office space Richard had access to, spreading documents across the table again. But this time, I wasn't just reading. I was connecting. I mapped every financial movement alongside every legal action tied to me. Every public statement from my mother, every social media narrative Vanessa pushed, every institutional step taken under the conservatorship filing. The pattern became undeniable. There were 3 simultaneous objectives. First, isolate me socially. Second, discredit me medically and legally. Third, transfer full inheritance control into a consolidated trust managed internally. But something stood out. There was an urgency in recent documents that hadn't existed before. Timelines had shortened. Approval thresholds were being bypassed. Even internal advisors were flagged for accelerated processing. Something had changed. The next morning, I asked Richard directly. "They're speeding up," I said. "Why now?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed a printed article on the table. It was an anonymous financial leak published overnight. It didn't mention my family directly, but it referenced suspicious inheritance restructuring patterns among high-net-worth families in the region, including offshore trust manipulation and internal beneficiary suppression. My eyes narrowed. "This is new," I said. "Yes," Richard confirmed, "and it's attracting attention faster than expected." I looked up. From who? Regulators, investigators, and media outlets that specialize in financial exposure cases. My chest tightened slightly. So they know they're being watched. Yes, that changed everything again. Because now my family was no longer operating in isolation. They were operating under pressure, and pressured systems made mistakes. I sat back slowly. "They'll increase control attempts," I said. Richard nodded. "Or they'll try to finalize everything before external scrutiny escalates." I understood what that meant immediately. They were entering a final phase, a compression stage. Everything I had been observing, the conservatorship filing, Vanessa's alignment, my father's silence, my mother's legal aggression, was converging into a single window of action. And I was inside that window with them. Not as a victim anymore, but as the last unresolved variable. Richard studied me carefully. "You're no longer reacting," he said. "No," I replied. "What are you doing then?" I looked at the documents one last time. "Mapping pressure points," I said quietly. He nodded once, as if that was the answer he expected. Outside the office, the city continued as if nothing was happening. People walked to work. Cars moved through intersections. Life operated normally above a system I now understood was anything but normal beneath its surface. And for the first time since everything began collapsing, I stopped feeling like I was inside a personal tragedy. I started recognizing the shape of something larger. After weeks of studying their system, I stopped thinking about revenge as an emotion. It became architecture. Every move I made now depended on timing, visibility, and controlled exposure. Richard called it pressure sequencing, but to me it felt more like stepping carefully inside a structure made of glass. One wrong move, and everything would collapse too early. I no longer avoided my family's orbit. I studied its edges. The first real shift came when I deliberately re-entered a space I knew Vanessa would eventually pass through. A private art charity event, listed under one of Laurent Holdings' cultural foundations. I didn't attend as myself. Richard helped me create a temporary identity under a freelance archival consultant role, tied loosely to documentation work. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave me access to the venue without drawing immediate attention. The event was exactly what I expected. Soft lighting, curated conversations, wealthy donors pretending to support art while negotiating influence behind polite smiles. And Vanessa was there. Of course she was. She stood near the center of the room like she belonged to it more than anyone else. My mother was not far away, speaking to investors with that controlled warmth she always used when she wanted something. I stayed at the edge of the hall observing, not hiding, not confronting, watching. That was the difference now. Vanessa laughed at something a man in a tailored suit said. Her posture was relaxed, confident, completely unaware that she was being observed differently than before. But I noticed something else too. She wasn't just socializing. She was directing conversations. Subtle redirections. Controlled introductions. Steering specific individuals toward my mother's network without appearing to do so. She wasn't just participating in influence, she was learning how to manage it. That realization sat heavier than I expected, because it meant my sister wasn't improvising anymore. She was trained. A few minutes later, My mother stepped onto a small stage to deliver a speech about charitable investments and education programs. Her voice carried easily across the room, measured, emotionally calibrated, perfectly structured for trust. But I wasn't listening to the speech. I was watching reactions. Every nod, every polite smile, every investor leaning slightly forward. They were responding to narrative, not truth. And my mother knew exactly how to control narrative. Halfway through the speech, I moved closer, not enough to be noticed, but enough to hear conversations around me more clearly. Two men standing near the bar were discussing the conservatorship case. "She's unstable, apparently," one of them said casually. "The daughter?" "Yeah. Apparently they've got medical documentation already." I kept my expression neutral. "They say she disappeared for weeks," the second man added. "Homeless situation, or something." A pause. "That family's been dealing with a lot." That sentence irritated me more than it should have, because it was exactly how misinformation stabilized itself. Not through aggression, but through repetition, softened into casual belief. I stepped away slowly before either of them could notice my reaction. Then I saw Vanessa again. This time, she was looking at me. Not directly, but her gaze had shifted slightly in my direction during a conversation. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Recognition. Not surprise. Not fear. Recognition. She knew I was there, but she didn't react. Instead, she turned back to the conversation she was having and smiled as if nothing had changed. That told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't going to expose me. Not yet, because I was still useful in my current position as an unseen variable. After the event, I followed her car again from a distance, not closely enough to be detected, just enough to map movement. She didn't go home immediately. Instead, she went to a secondary office location tied to one of the consulting firms listed in Richard's files. I stayed across the street in a cafe and watched her enter. She stayed inside for over an hour. When she came out, she was speaking on her phone again. I caught fragments. "Yes, we need the timeline tightened." "No, she hasn't contacted legal representation yet. If she does, we adjust narrative exposure accordingly." I recorded none of it. Recording would have escalated risk. Observation was enough. That night, I met Richard again. He was already waiting with updated files spread across a table. "You followed her," he said without looking up. "Yes." "Good," he replied. "What did you notice?" I paused before answering. "She's operational," I said. "Not just participating." Richard finally looked at me. "That's important," he said. I frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because it confirms something we suspected," he said. "Your mother isn't running everything alone anymore." I already knew where this was going. "Vanessa is fully integrated," I said. "Yes." The silence that followed felt heavier than usual. Richard leaned back slightly. "They've distributed control," he explained. "Which means even if your mother is targeted legally, the system doesn't collapse." I understood immediately. Redundancy. Backup structure. My family wasn't just centralized power anymore. It was networked. "That makes them harder to break," I said quietly. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "But also more complex." I looked at the documents again. "Complex systems have more vulnerabilities," I said. He nodded once. "That's why we needed you observing instead of reacting." That sentence stayed with me longer than expected, because for years I had been reacting to them emotionally, fighting isolated moments of cruelty without understanding the structure behind it. Now I wasn't reacting at all. I was mapping. Later that night, I replayed Vanessa's behavior in my mind repeatedly. The way she looked at me without changing expression. The way she continued her conversation without interruption. The way she compartmentalized recognition into non-action. That wasn't indifference. That was discipline. And discipline meant she had been trained to operate under controlled conditions, which meant someone had been preparing her for this role long before I realized what was happening. Possibly since childhood. That realization changed the emotional structure of everything again. because it meant I hadn't just been excluded. I had been positioned as external to their system from the beginning. And systems don't accidentally create outsiders. They design them. The next morning, Richard sent me a single message. They're stabilizing narratives before escalation. Watch timing. I understood immediately what he meant. Something was coming. And this time, I was no longer just a target. I was part of the equation they were actively trying to solve. The charity gala was announced 3 days before it happened. But I knew about it earlier. Richard flagged it the moment invitations started circulating through Laurent Holdings' network. It wasn't just another social event. It was a controlled environment designed for visibility, influence, and narrative reinforcement. My mother's specialty. Vanessa would be there too, of course. She rarely missed anything that involved public positioning anymore. I didn't decide to attend immediately. Instead, I studied the guest list for 2 full days. Investors, legal advisors, journalists tied to financial reporting, politicians with indirect ties to my mother's charitable foundation. It wasn't random. It never was. This wasn't a celebration. It was alignment. Richard met me the morning of the gala in a quiet office space with no windows again. He looked at me for a moment before speaking. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. Yes, he didn't argue further. Instead, he handed me a small device. Audio receiver. Passive only, he said. No transmission. Just capture if you're close enough. I took it carefully. This was the closest I had come to stepping directly back into their world since everything collapsed. But it no longer felt like returning. It felt like entering a controlled environment, with intention. The venue was a restored historic hall downtown, all marble columns, warm lighting, and soft orchestral music designed to make power feel elegant instead of predatory. I arrived later than most guests. Different name. Different identity. Carefully constructed under Richard's guidance. To them, I was just another consultant attending for professional exposure. To me, it was infiltration. Inside, everything looked familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten slightly. Wealth always looked the same at scale. It just changed decoration styles. I moved slowly through the crowd, staying near walls, observing interactions rather than participating in them. Conversations were layered, some about art, some about investment portfolios, some about partnerships that weren't officially documented anywhere. And then I saw her. My mother stood near the central stage again, dressed in deep blue, speaking calmly to a group of donors. Vanessa was beside her, slightly behind but visibly involved in every exchange. I paused. Watching them together, like that, triggered something uncomfortable. Not emotional pain exactly. Recognition of structure. They moved like a unit. My mother initiated. Vanessa reinforced. My father, I assumed, would appear later as silent validation if needed, and I realized something unsettling. I wasn't watching a family. I was watching a family hierarchy. I moved closer slowly, positioning myself within earshot of conversations near the main seating area. The audio device in my pocket picked up fragments of speech, but I didn't need everything, just patterns. A group of investors near the bar were discussing the conservatorship case again. The narrative had spread further than I expected. "She's still missing?" one asked. "No," another replied. "Apparently she's been unstable for months. Family is trying to protect assets and public image." "Sad situation," someone added. I stood there listening to strangers summarize my existence incorrectly as if it were fact. But I didn't react. That part of me had already been trained out. Then I saw Vanessa looking at me again. Same brief pause, same recognition, but again, no reaction. Instead, she excused herself from a conversation and walked toward a side corridor. I followed at a distance. Not urgently. Not emotionally. Just enough to maintain visibility. She stopped near a quieter section of the hall where fewer guests were present and answered a phone call. I stayed far enough not to be seen but close enough to hear fragments. "Yes, everything is stable on the narrative side." A pause. "No, she hasn't appeared publicly in any verified capacity." Another pause. "We proceed with documentation phase next week." Her tone wasn't emotional. It was procedural. That word again. Procedural. This wasn't manipulation in the chaotic sense I once imagined. It was workflow. I stayed still as she ended the call and returned to the main hall without acknowledging my presence again. That was the moment something inside me shifted, because I finally understood what Richard meant when he said they process threats differently. I wasn't a person to them anymore. I was a case file, a variable being monitored, a problem being contained. I returned to the main hall and positioned myself closer to the edge of the stage area as my mother began her formal speech. Her voice carried easily. Controlled empathy layered over strategic messaging. She spoke about legacy, responsibility, resilience of family structures, and community support systems. Every sentence was designed for interpretation rather than truth. People applauded at the right moments. They always did. I watched reactions more than her words, approval patterns, agreement cues, emotional synchronization. Then something unexpected happened. A journalist near the front row leaned toward another guest and whispered something while looking at me. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the glance. Then another, and another. The attention wasn't random, it was shifting. My presence was being noticed, not by my family, by external observers. Richard's warning came back instantly in my mind. External attention changes timelines. I stepped slightly backward, moving into a darker section near the side exits, recalibrating my position. My mother finished her speech to applause. Vanessa joined her on stage briefly afterward. And then it happened. A photographer from a financial publication stepped forward and took a direct shot in my direction. Not accidental. Focused. I froze for half a second, not fear. Calculation. Because if I was being visually documented now, it meant I was no longer fully invisible in their controlled narrative. And that meant acceleration. I left the venue shortly after without confrontation. No confrontation was needed. The system was already responding to me. When I met Richard later that night, he didn't ask what happened first. He looked at the photos I had taken and nodded slowly. "They've noticed external interest," he said. "Yes," I replied. He exhaled slightly. "Then we don't have weeks anymore." I already knew what that meant. The structure I had been studying for weeks was entering compression. Everything was speeding up, and I was no longer just observing it from the outside. The recording was not supposed to happen like this. Richard had warned me that anything involving direct exposure inside their system needed precision, timing, and distance. But after the gala, something shifted in the environment around my family. Their behavior became sharper, more defensive, like they were responding to pressure they hadn't fully acknowledged yet. I felt it before I saw it. The system was tightening. That morning, Richard met me earlier than usual. He looked exhausted, not physically, but mentally, like he had been tracking too many moving parts at once. "They accelerated again," he said immediately. I already knew what that meant without asking. "They filed updated documentation," he continued, placing a printed stack on the table. "And they're preparing a public confirmation statement." I scanned the first page. My name appeared in a legal declaration again, but this time it wasn't just conservatorship framing. It included references to behavioral instability in social environments, financial irresponsibility, and documented episodes of unpredictable conduct. I looked up slowly. "They're building final justification language," I said. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "They're closing the narrative loop." That phrase stayed with me, closing the narrative loop. It meant they weren't just trying to control me anymore. They were trying to make the story complete enough that no one would question it again. That was the moment I realized I couldn't remain passive inside observation anymore. Something had to break. Richard didn't stop me when I said I needed access to one more event. A smaller internal investor meeting tied to one of my mother's subsidiary financial boards. It wasn't public like the gala. It was private, controlled, and designed specifically for decision-making among trusted individuals, which made it more dangerous and more useful. We didn't discuss emotion that day. We discussed timing, entry points, exit points, blind zones and security rotation. where conversations overlapped enough to capture audio without standing directly in focus. Richard handed me a modified passive recording device again. "This is your last controlled window," he said. I nodded. I know. The venue was inside a private corporate building downtown. No press. No public visibility. Only selected investors and internal advisors. I entered with a temporary consultancy badge again. By now, I had learned how easy it was to exist inside their world, if you looked like you belonged there for even a few seconds. Inside, everything felt more contained than the gala. Less performance. More execution. People weren't performing wealth. They were discussing control. I positioned myself near a corridor connecting two meeting rooms. From there, I could hear overlapping conversations without being directly inside any one group. The audio device picked up fragments immediately. Final, stage approval. Risk containment strategy is holding. She hasn't made any legal move yet. I stayed still, pretending to review documents on a tablet I wasn't actually reading. Then I heard it. My mother's voice. Close. Not amplified, like at public events. Natural. Focused. She was inside the adjacent room speaking to legal advisors. I moved slightly closer without being visible to the glass partition. What I heard next changed everything again. She needs to be officially categorized before external pressure escalates further, my mother said. A pause. Yes, I understand the urgency, another voice replied. Vanessa spoke next. Calm. Structured. The public narrative is stable, but we need confirmation language ready within 48 hours. 48 hours. That wasn't planning anymore, that was execution timing. I stayed frozen, listening. And then something unexpected happened. A different voice responded inside the room. Are you certain she hasn't retained independent legal representation? A brief silence followed. My mother answered. She has no verified residence. No financial access. No stable contact structure. Vanessa added immediately. She is functionally isolated. Functionally isolated. That phrase felt clinical enough to detach me from emotion entirely. But then something shifted again. A second later, I heard my name spoken directly. Not as a topic. As a classification. Evelyn Laurent will be formally submitted for evaluation finalization, my mother said. That was it. Finalization. Not discussion. Not assessment. Finalization. My grip tightened slightly on the device in my pocket. Then came the sentence that forced everything inside me into stillness. If she appears publicly before filing completion, we proceed with emergency narrative enforcement. Emergency narrative enforcement. That meant escalation. Immediate containment. I stepped back slowly from the corridor. Not because I was scared. Because I had heard enough. Richard was waiting outside the building when I exited. He looked at me once and immediately understood something had changed. You recorded it, he said. Yes, I replied. We didn't go back to the office. We went somewhere quieter. A neutral space where Richard could extract and stabilize the audio without risk of immediate tracing. It took him less than an hour. When he played the recording back, I listened to my mother, Vanessa, and the advisors speaking in controlled, structured language that stripped all humanity from what they were planning. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even cruelty in the traditional sense. It was procedure. After it ended, Richard leaned back slightly. This is enough, he said quietly. For what? He looked at me directly. To force external review. I didn't respond immediately. Because I understood what that meant. Once this became external, it would no longer be contained within their system. It would become public structure. And public structure didn't follow their control anymore. It followed exposure logic. But I also understood something else. This was the point where they would realize I was no longer just a missing variable. I was an active source of disruption, and systems always respond differently when they recognize that after Richard extracted the audio, everything became quieter in a way that felt unnatural, not peaceful, controlled. It was as if the system around my family had finally registered that something inside it was no longer behaving predictably. I could feel it in the way Richard stopped receiving routine updates, in the way legal documents stopped flowing with the same timing patterns, and in the way my mother's communications shifted from structured confidence to compressed urgency. They knew something had leaked, not what, but that something had escaped their containment model. Richard didn't say much that day. He simply reviewed the recording again, line by line, pausing at key phrases as if confirming internal thresholds. "This is no longer internal," he said finally. I understood immediately what that meant. It meant the boundary had been crossed. The private system I had been observing for weeks was now exposed to external interpretation. Once that happened, control shifted from execution to defense, and defensive systems behave differently. More aggressive, more unpredictable. That night, I didn't go back to Miriam's apartment. I stayed in a temporary, secure location Richard arranged through one of his contacts. It wasn't luxurious or comfortable, but it was neutral, which mattered more than comfort now. I spent most of the night replaying the recording in my mind without actually listening to it again. My mother's voice, Vanessa's structured alignment, the clinical phrasing of finalization and emergency narrative enforcement. Those weren't emotional decisions. They were procedural endpoints. And I was the variable they were trying to resolve before external exposure completed its trajectory. Around dawn, Richard sent a message. "We need to move." No explanation, no detail, just urgency compressed into 2 words. When I met him, he looked different again. More alert, more contained. Like he had already shifted into a different operational mode. "They escalated internally," he said immediately. I didn't need to ask what that meant. "They've activated legal acceleration protocols," he continued. "Emergency filings are being prepared for immediate submission." My chest tightened slightly. "Based on what?" "The recording," he said. "That confirmed it." They knew. Not everything, but enough to trigger acceleration. Richard placed another set of documents in front of me. This time, they weren't financial. They were procedural. Court filing drafts, medical evaluation requests, affidavit structures designed to support immediate conservatorship enforcement. My name appeared repeatedly, but not as a person, as a classification, subject, evaluation case, risk profile. I stared at it without speaking for a long moment. "They're preparing to finalize it publicly," I said quietly. "Yes," Richard confirmed. "And once it's filed?" He paused slightly before answering. "Then it becomes legally actionable within hours, not weeks." That sentence settled heavily. Hours, not weeks. The system had shifted from slow manipulation to rapid execution. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "So this is the point where they try to lock it permanently?" Richard nodded once. "Yes." A silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just finalizing. Then I asked the question I had avoided for too long. "What happens if I do nothing?" He looked at me directly. "Then they win by default." That was the simplest explanation possible, and the most dangerous. Because systems like this didn't require dramatic failure to succeed. They only required absence of resistance. I stood up slowly. "I'm not disappearing," I said. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied me for a moment longer than usual. Then he nodded once. "Then we shift exposure forward." That phrase changed the direction of everything again. Exposure forward. It meant we weren't waiting for their filing anymore. We were moving before it. But timing was critical. Too early, and the system would dismiss it as noise. Too late, and it would become legally irrelevant. Richard began outlining the structure quickly. Media channels tied to financial investigation networks. Legal whistleblower protections. Controlled release sequencing designed to ensure the recording reached verified analysts before it reached public distortion layers. I listened without interrupting. Not because I didn't understand, but because I was realizing something else. This wasn't just about truth anymore. It was about control of interpretation. By midday, everything was prepared. The recording was segmented, verified, layered with contextual documentation Richard had compiled over weeks. My grandmother's notes were included. Financial trails were attached. Timeline correlation files were added. It wasn't just evidence, it was structure. Before releasing it, Richard paused. "This will change how they respond," he said. I nodded. "I know." He studied me again. "Once it goes out, they won't treat you as internal anymore." "I know that too," I said. He hesitated slightly. "Are you ready for that?" I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was not about readiness. It was about inevitability. I thought about Manessa's voice, about my mother's controlled language, about my father's silence across all of it, and I realized something simple but final. I had already stopped being part of their system the moment I began understanding it. "I'm already outside it," I said finally. Richard nodded once. Then he initiated the release sequence. We didn't wait for immediate reaction. We didn't need to, because once the recording entered verified channels, it began spreading through layers that no longer belonged to my family's control structure. Internal advisory networks first, then investigative intermediaries, then financial oversight channels, and finally, media filtration systems that would determine how it would eventually become public. But even before it fully propagated, Richard's phone started receiving alerts. Fast. Too fast. He looked at the screen once and exhaled slightly. "They've detected exposure propagation," he said. I looked at him. "And?" "They're initiating full containment response." That was the moment I understood what came next. Not confrontation, not negotiation. Containment. The first public ripple didn't come from my family. It came from outside their control. A financial investigative platform picked up the recording within hours of controlled release. Not the full context at first, just fragments. Enough to trigger attention, but not enough to be dismissed as noise. That was Richard's strategy. Controlled exposure. Layered credibility. By the time my mother realized the spread couldn't be contained internally, it was already moving through multiple verification channels. I wasn't there when the first internal meeting collapsed, but I could imagine it clearly, because I had seen their system long enough to understand what disruption looked like inside it. Richard received the first confirmed reaction at noon. "They've activated crisis containment," he said without looking up from his screen. I understood immediately. Containment didn't mean denial anymore. It meant damage control at structural level. We didn't celebrate. There was no emotional victory. Only acceleration of consequence. Within hours, media interpretations began forming. Carefully worded at first. Speculative analysis. Anonymous sourcing. Financial irregularities tied to offshore inheritance structures similar to Laurent Holdings. Not direct accusation yet. But alignment was forming. My mother's system depended on narrative control, not truth control. Once narrative fragmentation began, everything they built started losing coherence. That was the real fracture point. Richard and I moved again that day, not because we were escaping, because positioning mattered more than location now. We shifted into a secure intermediary office provided by one of his legal contacts, someone who specialized in regulatory exposure cases. It wasn't part of my family's known network, which made it safer. Barely. The space was minimal, functional. Screens, encrypted terminals, and continuous monitoring feeds, tracking early media propagation. Richard kept analyzing incoming reports. "They're trying to frame it as internal misunderstanding," he said. I watched the feeds. Different outlets were already taking different angles. Some focused on inheritance irregularities. Some on corporate governance concerns. Others on family dispute escalation. But the recording had already done its job. It had introduced doubt, and doubt spreads faster than certainty. By evening, something unexpected happened. My father appeared in one of the internal advisory responses. Not physically, not publicly, but through a legal statement drafted on behalf of the family structure. He was confirming awareness of internal misinterpretation, and supporting temporary stabilization measures. I stared at it for a long moment. He's aligning with them, I said quietly. Richard didn't respond immediately. Then he said, he's protecting his position. That was worse in a different way, because it confirmed something I had been avoiding. My father wasn't neutral. He was adaptive, and adaptation meant survival within their system, not resistance against it. I didn't feel anger. That surprised me. Instead, I felt clarity, a cleaner separation between emotional expectation and operational reality. That distinction mattered now more than anything else. By nightfall, the situation escalated further. External financial regulators issued preliminary inquiry notices regarding offshore trust behavior patterns linked to Laurent Holdings subsidiaries. It wasn't direct investigation yet, but it was structured attention. Unstructured attention forces disclosure. Richard looked at me when he saw the notice. This is the point where they lose control of narrative speed, he said. I understood what he meant. My family had always controlled timing. Now they were reacting to it, and reaction is always weaker than initiation. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I reviewed everything again. Not the emotional parts, not the betrayal, not the family history, just structure. Every document, every recording fragment, every timeline alignment, something stood out this time that hadn't before. My grandmother's involvement wasn't just protective. It was predictive. She hadn't just documented wrongdoing. She had mapped escalation potential, and in her notes, there was a phrase repeated twice. Final exposure threshold. I asked Richard about it the next morning. He paused when I showed him. This is what she called the point of irreversible feasibility, he said. Meaning once certain information crosses external systems, containment becomes impossible. I looked at him. So we've crossed it. He nodded once. Yes, that should have felt like victory. It didn't. Because systems don't collapse immediately after exposure. They resist. And resistance often creates unpredictable behavior. By midday, internal communications from my mother's legal team shifted tone again. More aggressive language appeared. References to emergency injunctions, defamation countermeasures, narrative stabilization demands. They were no longer trying to maintain quiet control. They were trying to suppress movement. But it was too late for that. Because once external interpretation begins, internal suppression only amplifies attention. Richard pointed at one of the monitors. They're isolating you as the central trigger now, he said. I looked. My name appeared in multiple new filings. Not as a passive subject, but as initiating variable. That meant the system had officially reclassified me. I wasn't a liability anymore. I was the cause of disruption. And causes get targeted differently than victims. That realization shifted something again inside me. Not fear. Not hesitation. Focus. Because now everything was converging faster than expected. And convergence always leads to one thing in structured systems. Resolution attempts. By the time Chapter 20 began unfolding in real time, nothing in my life still resembled what I once called normal. The recording had already spread beyond controlled channels. What started as a carefully sequenced exposure had now entered uncontrolled circulation. Investigative outlets, financial analysts, and legal commentators were all dissecting fragments of it, building interpretations that no longer required my family's permission to exist. And that was the shift they couldn't reverse. Control over narrative had been replaced by interpretation. Richard explained it in one sentence that morning while monitoring live feeds. It's no longer containment, he said. It's damage triage. I understood exactly what that meant. Containment assumes control is still possible. Charge assumes loss is already happening. My mother's system was no longer stabilizing itself. It was deciding what to sacrifice. And I was the variable at the center of that decision tree. We were inside a secure monitoring space again, but the atmosphere had changed. Screens displayed cascading news updates, legal filings, and financial alerts in real time. The structure I had spent weeks mapping was now visible in public motion. My name appeared across multiple channels, not as rumor anymore. As reference point. As subject of inquiry. Richard didn't speak much at first. He was tracking response patterns across different jurisdictions, watching how quickly regulatory bodies were reacting now that the exposure had reached verification thresholds. "They're coordinating responses across networks," he said finally. I looked at the screen. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means your recording didn't just reach media," he replied. "It reached institutions. That changed the pressure entirely. Media creates attention. Institutions create consequences. And consequences cannot be selectively ignored." I sat down slowly. For the first time since everything began collapsing, I wasn't thinking about my family emotionally. I was thinking about their system structurally under stress, because that's what it had become now. A stress system always reveals internal hierarchy, and hierarchy always breaks in predictable layers. First communication control, then narrative cohesion, then internal trust. By midday, the first fracture appeared. A leaked internal statement from my mother's legal advisory team surfaced indirectly. It wasn't meant for public release, but someone inside had already started distancing themselves. The language was different this time. Less confident. More procedural panic. Risk exposure exceeds managed thresholds. External interpretation cannot be stabilized within current timeline. Recommend partial asset decoupling. I watched it without emotion. This wasn't drama anymore. It was system degradation. Richard leaned forward slightly. "They're preparing separation strategies," he said. "Separation from what?" "From each other," he replied. That was the first moment I fully understood what exposure had done. It didn't just threaten them externally. It destabilized internal loyalty. Because when systems face collapse, survival overrides alignment. And alignment between my mother, Vanessa, and my father was no longer guaranteed. By afternoon, another shift occurred. Vanessa appeared in a public-facing clarification statement. Short, controlled, carefully worded. She did not deny involvement. She reframed it. Misinterpretation of internal family restructuring processes has led to external misrepresentation. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't defending innocence, she was defending structure. But structure under scrutiny is already weakening. Richard noticed my expression. "She's trying to preserve operational legitimacy," he said. I nodded slightly. "She's not stepping back." "No," he confirmed. "She's stabilizing her position." That meant she still believed the system could be salvaged. My mother, however, was responding differently. By evening, emergency legal filings began appearing under accelerated court review channels. Requests for injunctions against media dissemination, attempts to classify recordings as private familial misrepresentation. But there was a problem now. Too many independent sources had already verified fragments. And once verification spreads, suppression becomes ineffective. Richard pointed at another update. "They're losing jurisdictional control," he said. I looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means different regions are responding differently. Some are escalating. Others are refusing suppression requests." I exhaled slowly. The system wasn't collapsing uniformly. It was fragmenting. And fragmentation creates unpredictability. That was the dangerous part now. Not control. Not containment. Unpredictable behavior inside a collapsing hierarchy. That night, I finally heard from my father directly. Not through filings. Not through statements. A short encrypted message sent through Richard's secured line. "You need to stop this before it expands further." I stared at it for a long time before replying. "Stop what exactly?" No answer came immediately. When it did, it was shorter. Everything. That single word told me more than any legal document ever had. Because it confirmed something I had already begun to understand. He wasn't speaking as an ally. He was speaking as someone inside a system trying to prevent full collapse. Richard saw the message and didn't comment immediately. Then he said something I didn't expect. He's not trying to save them, he said. He's trying to prevent exposure from reaching total system breakdown. I looked at him. What happens at total breakdown? He paused. Everything becomes public record. That was the final threshold. Not legal consequence. Not financial loss. Full structural exposure. I sat back slowly. For the first time, I understood the scale of what I had triggered. It wasn't just a family confrontation anymore. It was systemic exposure of an entire controlled inheritance network that had functioned invisibly for years. And now it was unraveling in real time. Richard turned off one of the monitors briefly. You've crossed their final containment boundary, he said quietly. I didn't respond immediately. Because I already knew what came after that boundary. Not negotiation, not recovery. Resolution attempts. And those attempts never stay contained within one side. By the time the system reached full fragmentation, I stopped recognizing the difference between private life and structural consequence. Everything had merged. The recording had now been officially referenced in multiple investigative briefings, not as leaked content anymore, but as verified evidence under review. That shift alone changed how institutions treated my family. It was no longer a narrative dispute. It was now procedural escalation. Richard explained it in one sentence that morning. They're no longer trying to disprove it, he said. They're trying to control fallout distribution. I understood what that meant immediately. When truth becomes too stable to erase, systems stop fighting truth itself. They start managing where the damage lands. And I was now part of that damage map. The monitoring space we were using had shifted into a higher security environment. Fewer people had access. Fewer channels were open. The outside world was now feeding updates through filtered institutional summaries rather than raw media interpretation. That alone told me how serious it had become. My mother's network was still functioning, but not uniformly. Richard tracked internal dissonance across multiple communication layers. Some legal advisors were still defending structure. Others were quietly withdrawing. A few had already shifted language entirely, reframing involvement as misinterpreted advisory participation. That phrase kept repeating. Misinterpreted. It was the safest exit strategy in collapsing systems. Vanessa's position, however, remained active. That surprised me at first. She hadn't distanced herself. She had reinforced alignment. Her latest statement wasn't defensive anymore. It was strategic clarification, aimed at preserving operational continuity rather than personal reputation. That distinction mattered, because it meant she was not reacting to collapse. She was adapting inside it. Richard pointed at one of the incoming updates. She's trying to take partial control of narrative stabilization, he said. I looked at the screen. It showed internal restructuring, references tied to her name, indicating she was now involved in emergency coordination discussions. She's positioning for post-collapse authority, I said quietly. He nodded. Yes. That realization changed how I interpreted everything about her behavior from the beginning. Vanessa was never emotionally reacting to me. She was adjusting her role inside a system she already understood. I was not a sibling in her perspective anymore. I was a structural disruption. That separation mattered more than anything else. By afternoon, external regulatory pressure intensified again. Multiple jurisdictions issued synchronized inquiry escalations. This time there was no ambiguity in tone. It was formal, procedural, and immediate. My mother's legal structure responded aggressively at first. Then inconsistently. Then fragmentedly. Richard monitored it in silence for several minutes before speaking. The internal coherence threshold is breaking, he said. I looked up. What does that mean exactly? It means they can no longer maintain a single unified response strategy. That was the moment collapse became visible in real time. Not emotional collapse. Operational collapse. A system losing synchronization between its own parts. My father appeared again briefly in one of the filtered internal communications. Not as a dominant voice, but as a stabilizing attempt. He was advocating for controlled cooperation with regulatory bodies to prevent total exposure expansion. His language was careful, structured, but noticeably different from my mother's or Vanessa's. Less strategic aggression, more containment caution. Richard noticed it too. He's trying to slow escalation, he said. Why? I asked. Because full exposure removes all remaining internal control. I stared at the screen. That meant my father wasn't defending the system. He was trying to limit its collapse radius. But systems and fragmentation rarely respect moderation attempts. By evening, the first major institutional breach occurred. A regulatory body issued a formal notice of asset freezing review tied to offshore structures associated with Laurent Holdings subsidiaries. It wasn't confirmation of wrongdoing yet, but it was enough to restrict movement. And that restriction triggered immediate reaction. My mother's network escalated internally, attempting rapid asset reallocation strategies. Vanessa was directly referenced in coordination logs now, indicating she had become operationally active in crisis response. Everything was accelerating again. Richard closed one of the monitoring feeds briefly. They're entering final containment behavior, he said. I looked at him. What does that look like? He paused slightly before answering. Isolation, denial, fragmentation control, and narrative exhaustion strategies. I understood the sequence immediately. First isolate the source, then deny external validity, then fragment internal cohesion, then exhaust external attention. But the problem now was simple. External attention had already stabilized. It was no longer fading. It was expanding. That meant exhaustion strategy wouldn't work the way they intended. Later that night, Richard received another internal advisory leak. This one was different. It wasn't legal. It was psychological risk assessment. My name appeared under a classification header again. But this time, the wording had changed. Not unstable. Not liability. Now it read, uncontained external variable with irreversible narrative activation potential. I stared at it for a long time. That phrase mattered more than anything else I'd seen. Because it meant they were no longer trying to define me as a person within their system. They were defining me as something outside it entirely. Richard noticed my expression. They've shifted classification, he said quietly. I nodded once. Yes, that was the final transition point in their internal language structure. From subject to variable. From variable to external factor. And external factors are no longer managed internally. They are responded to. I stood up slowly. What happens next? I asked. Richard looked at me for a moment longer than usual. Now they stop reacting separately, he said, and start responding collectively. That sentence changed everything again. Because collective response meant consolidation under pressure, and consolidation under pressure always produces one outcome. Final intervention attempts. And once those begin, the system stops behaving like parts of a family and starts behaving like a single unit trying to survive collapse. The final escalation didn't announce itself with noise. It arrived as silence first. A structured silence. By morning, Richard's monitoring feeds showed something unusual. An abrupt reduction in internal communications from my mother's advisory network. No legal updates. No procedural filings. No corrective statements. At first, it looked like stabilization, but Richard didn't interpret it that way. This isn't stabilization, he said immediately. This is consolidation. I looked at him. What's the difference? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a set of layered system logs showing a synchronized shift across all known internal channels tied to Laurent Holdings. Every active communication thread had been redirected into a single encrypted stream. That meant one thing. Unified control response. They've centralized decision authority, he said. I understood immediately. The fragmentation we had been observing, my mother, Vanessa, my father, legal advisors, was no longer visible. It had collapsed into a single coordinated response structure, which meant they were done negotiating internally. Now they were executing externally. Richard shut down half the monitors. We need to assume full containment mode is active, he said. I didn't respond immediately, because something else felt different. Not fear. Not anticipation. Wait. like the system had finally stopped pretending and started moving in a single direction. By midday, external regulatory feeds confirmed emergency hearings were being scheduled. Fast-track jurisdictional review had been triggered across multiple oversight bodies. The language used was no longer exploratory, it was procedural urgency. Assets under review. Governance integrity concerns. Potential structural fraud indicators. The phrasing mattered less than the speed. Everything was moving too quickly now for controlled narrative shaping. Richard stood near the console, tracking jurisdictional alignment. "They're trying to resolve this before it fully becomes public synchronization," he said. I looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means if too many systems align at once, they lose control of interpretation entirely." That was the point they were trying to avoid. Not exposure. Synchronized exposure. Because once multiple systems interpret the same truth simultaneously, control becomes impossible. I sat down slowly. "So they're trying to contain interpretation windows," I said. "Yes," Richard confirmed. The room felt different now. Heavier. Not because of fear, but because of inevitability. Around that time, my father's name reappeared again. This time, not in internal advisory logs, but in formal compliance outreach documentation. He had initiated a procedural cooperation request. Not resistance. Not alignment. Controlled disclosure participation. Richard read it twice before speaking. "He's trying to negotiate visibility boundaries," he said. I looked at the screen. "What does that mean exactly?" "He's trying to decide what gets exposed and what doesn't." That was the clearest explanation of his position I had ever heard. He wasn't defending my mother. He wasn't opposing her either. He was trying to contain structural collapse into manageable segments, but systems don't respect partial control during final phase escalation. By late afternoon, the first public synchronized reports appeared across multiple financial channels simultaneously. Not speculation anymore. Aligned reporting. Different outlets. Different jurisdictions. Same core narrative structure. Unauthorized inheritance restructuring. Offshore asset routing. Internal beneficiary suppression patterns. My name was now consistently included. Not as rumor. As verified subject of inquiry. Richard turned toward me slowly. "This is it," he said quietly. I understood immediately. This was no longer escalation. This was resolution phase initiation. Not resolution as in clarity. Resolution as in system conclusion attempt. By evening, internal emergency filings from my mother's network were fully visible through leaked procedural summaries. The language was no longer controlled legal framing. It was defensive fragmentation, attempts to isolate responsibility, attempts to reclassify involvement tiers, attempts to decouple Vanessa's operational role from my mother's primary liability exposure, but the structure was failing. Because too many external systems had already synchronized interpretation. At that point, Richard stopped speaking for several minutes. He was watching something on a separate feed. Finally, he spoke. "They've initiated full containment withdrawal," he said. I looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means they're no longer trying to control outcome," he said. "They're trying to survive visibility." That distinction mattered more than anything else so far. Control implies future shaping. Survival implies present minimization. And minimization often requires sacrifice. I stood up slowly. "Who gets sacrificed?" I asked. Richard didn't answer immediately. Then he said it carefully. "Internal hierarchy, weakest links." I didn't need clarification. My position in their system had always been classified as external liability. But Vanessa and my mother were now inside the same collapsing framework, which meant internal prioritization decisions were being made in real time. That realization shifted something inside me again. Not emotionally, structurally, because systems under survival pressure always compress decision layers into fewer hands. And fewer hands always make faster, harsher decisions. Richard shut down another monitor. "We need to prepare for final external confirmation," he said. I looked at him. "What happens after confirmation?" He paused. "Then the system stops being private." That was the final threshold. Not legal exposure, not media coverage, public structural collapse recognition. I sat back slowly. Everything I had been observing for weeks, financial trails, legal escalation, narrative manipulation, internal fragmentation, was converging into a single endpoint. Not justice, not revenge, not even resolution in emotional terms. Just exposure completion. And once exposure completes, systems don't return to previous structure. They rebuild or they disappear. Richard looked at me one last time before speaking. "They're no longer reacting to you," he said. I nodded slowly. "I know." He continued. "They're reacting to everything you've already set in motion." That was the moment I realized something that had been forming quietly for a while. I was no longer inside their system. I was the condition that had forced it to reveal itself. What started as a hidden family conflict didn't stay hidden for long. Once every layer of control began to collapse. When systems built on silence and manipulation lose their structure, they don't end quietly, they unravel in fragments, each piece exposing more than it can protect. In the middle of that unraveling stood one constant, the truth that had been buried for years, finally refusing to stay contained. Every attempt to control the narrative only accelerated its exposure, and every move to suppress it created a wider reach than before. But nothing in this kind of collapse ever feels clean. There are no perfect victories, no simple resolutions, only consequences unfolding in real time, reshaping everything they touch. And as the final structures begin to break apart, one question remains louder than all the rest. When control disappears completely, who is left standing when the dust finally settles?